Chapter 75 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 75. How Aurilly executed the commission of the Duke d'Anjou. To the confusion occasioned by the departure of the troops, a profound silence succeeded. When Remy believed the house to be empty, he went down to prepare for his departure and that of Diana. But on opening the door of the room below, he was much surprised to see a man sitting by the fire, evidently watching him, although he pretended to look careless. Remy approached, according to his custom, with a slow, halting step, and uncovering his head, bald like that of an old man. He could not, however, see the features of the man by the fire.
"Pardon, monsieur," said he. "I thought myself alone here."
"I also thought so," replied the man, "but I see with pleasure that I shall have companions."
"Oh, very sad companions, monsieur, for except an invalid young man whom I am taking back to France."
"Ah," said Aurilly, "I know who you mean."
"Really?"
"Yes, you mean the young lady."
"What young lady?"
"Oh, do not be angry, my good friend. I am the steward of the house of Joyeuse, and I rejoined my young master by his brother's order, and at his departure the comte recommended to my good offices a young lady and an old servant, who were returning to France." As he thus spoke, he approached Remy with a smiling and affectionate look, but Remy stepped back, and a look of horror was painted for an instant on his face. "You do not reply; one would say you were afraid of me," said Aurilly with his most smiling face.
"Monsieur," replied Remy, "pardon a poor old man whom his misfortunes and his wounds have rendered timid and suspicious."
"All the more reason, my friend, for accepting the help and support of an honest companion. Besides, as I told you just now, I speak on the part of a master who must inspire you with confidence."
"Assuredly, monsieur,"
replied Remy, who, however, still moved back. "You quit me?" said Aurilly.
"I must consult my mistress. I can decide nothing, you understand."
"Oh, that is natural, but permit me to present myself. I will explain my directions in all their details."
No, thank you. Madame is perhaps asleep, and her sleep is sacred to me."
"As you wish. Besides, I have told you what my master told me to say."
"To me?"
"To you and the young lady."
"Your master, Monsieur le Comte de Bouchage, you mean?"
"Yes."
"Thank you, monsieur."
When he had shut the door, all the appearances of age vanished, except the bald head, and Remy mounted the staircase with an agility more like a young man of 25 than the old man he had appeared to be a few minutes before.
"Madame, madame!"
cried he in an agitated voice.
"Well, what is it, Remy? Is not the duke gone?"
"Yes, madame, but there is a worse demon here, a demon on whom during 6 years I have daily called down heaven's vengeance, as you have on his master."
"Aurilly?"
"Yes, Aurilly. The wretch is below, forgotten by his infernal accomplice."
"Forgotten, do you say, Remy? Oh, you are wrong. You who know the duke know that he never leaves to chance any evil deed, if he can do it himself. No, no, Remy, Aurilly is not forgotten, but left here for some bad design. Believe me."
"Oh, about him, madame, I can believe anything."
"Does he know me?"
"I do not think so."
"And did he recognize you?"
"Oh, madame," said Remy with a sad smile, "no one recognizes me."
"Perhaps he guessed who I am?"
"No, for he asked to see you."
"I am sure he must have suspicions."
"In that case, nothing is more easy, and I thank God for pointing out our path so plainly. The village is deserted, the wretch is alone. I saw a poniard in his belt, but I have a knife in mine."
"One moment, Remy. I do not ask the life of that wretch of you, but before you kill him, let us find out what he wants of us. Perhaps we may make his evil intentions useful. How did he represent himself to you, Remy?"
"As the steward of Monsieur de Bouchage, madame."
"You see he lies. Therefore he has some reason for lying. Let us find out his intentions and conceal our own."
"I will act as you wish, madame."
"What does he ask now?"
"To accompany us."
"In what character?"
As the count's steward.
Tell him I accept.
Oh, madame.
And that I am thinking of going to England, where I have relations, but have not quite decided. Lie like him, Remy. To conquer, we must fight with equal arms.
But he will see you.
I will wear my mask. Besides, I suspect he knows me.
Then, if he knows you, there must be a snare.
Let us pretend to fall into it.
But
what do you fear? We can but die. Are you not ready to die for the accomplishment of our vow?
Yes, but to die without vengeance.
Remy,
cried Diana, her eyes sparkling with wild excitement.
Be easy. We will be revenged. You on the servant and I on the master.
Well, madame, then so be it.
And Remy went down, but still hesitating. The brave young man had, at the sight of Aurilly, felt in spite of himself that nervous shudder that one feels at the sight of a reptile. He wished to kill him because he feared him. But as he went down, his resolution returned, and he determined, in spite of Diana's opinion, to interrogate Aurilly, to confound him, and if he discovered that he had any evil intentions, to kill him on the spot. Aurilly waited for him impatiently. Remy advanced armed with an unshakable resolution, but his words were quiet and calm.
Monsieur, said he, my mistress cannot accept your proposal.
And why not?
Because you are not the steward of Monsieur de Bouchage.
Aurilly grew pale. Who told you so? Said he.
No one, but Monsieur de Bouchage, when he left, recommended to my care the person whom I accompany, and never spoke of you.
He only saw me after he left you.
Falsehoods, monsieur, falsehoods.
Aurilly drew himself up. Remy looked like an old man. You speak in a singular tone, my good man, said he, frowning. Take care. You are old, and I am young. You are feeble, and I am strong. Remy smiled, but did not reply. If I wished ill to you or your mistress, continued Aurilly, I have but to raise my hand.
Oh, said Remy, perhaps I was wrong, and you wish to do her good.
Certainly I do.
Explain to me, then, what you desire.
My friend, I will make your fortune at once, if you will serve me.
And if not?
In that case, as you speak frankly, I will reply as frankly, and that I will kill you. I have full power to do so.
Kill me? Said Remy. But if I am to serve you, I must know your projects.
Well, you have guessed rightly, my good man. I do not belong to the Comte de Bouchage.
Ah, and to whom do you belong?
To a more powerful lord.
Take care, you are lying again.
Why so?
There are not many people above the house of Joyeuse.
Not that of France.
Oh.
And see how they pay, said Aurilly, sliding into Remy's hand one of the rouleaux of gold. Remy shuddered and took a step back, but controlling himself, said,
You serve the king?
No, but his brother, the Duke d'Anjou.
Oh, very well. I am the duke's most humble servant.
That is excellent.
But what does Monseigneur want?
Monseigneur, said Aurilly, trying again to slip the gold into Remy's hand, is in love with your mistress.
He knows her, then?
He has seen her.
Seen her? When?
This evening.
Impossible. She has not left her room.
No, but the prince, by his conduct, has shown that he is really in love.
Why, what did he do?
Took a ladder and climbed to the balcony.
Ah, he did that?
Yes, and it seems she is very beautiful.
Then you have not seen her?
No, but from what he said, I much wish to do so, if only to judge of the exaggeration of his love. Thus, then, it is agreed you will aid me. And he again offered him the gold.
Certainly I will, but I must know what part I am to play, said Remy, repulsing his hand.
First, tell me, is the lady the mistress of Monsieur de Bouchage or of his brother? The blood mounted to Remy's face.
Of neither, said he. The lady upstairs has no lover.
No lover? But then she is a wonder.
Morbleu! A woman who has no lover! We have found the philosopher's stone." "Then," said Remy, "what does Monsieur le Duc d'Anjou want my mistress to do?" "He wants her to come to Chateau Thierry, where he is going at his utmost speed." "This is, upon my word, a passion very quickly conceived." "That is like Monseigneur." "I only see one difficulty," said Remy. "What is that?" "That my mistress is about to embark for England." "Diable! This, then, is where you must try to aid me." "How?" "By persuading her to go in an opposite direction." "You do not know my mistress, monsieur. She is not easily persuaded. Besides, even if she were persuaded to go to Chateau Thierry instead of England, do you think she would yield to the prince?" "Why not?" "She does not love the duke." "Bah! Not love a prince of the blood." "But if Monseigneur the Duc d'Anjou suspects my mistress of loving Monsieur de Bouchage or Monsieur de Joyeuse, how did he come to think of carrying her off from him she loved?" "My good man," said Aurilly, "you have trivial ideas, and I fear we shall never understand each other. I have preferred kindness to violence, but if you force me to change my plans, well, I will change them." "What will you do?" "I told you I had full powers from the duke to kill you and carry off the lady." "And you believe you could do it with impunity?" "I believe all my master tells me to believe. Come, will you persuade your mistress to come to France?" "I will try, but I can answer for nothing." "And when shall I have the answer?" "I will go up at once and see what I can do." "Well, go up. I will wait. But one last word. You know that your fortune and life hang on your answer." "I know it." "That will do. I will go and get the horses ready." "Do not be in too great a hurry." "Bah! I am sure of the answer. No one is cruel to a prince." "I fancied that happened sometimes." "Yes, but very rarely." While Remy went up, Aurilly proceeded to the stables without feeling any doubt as to the result. "Well?" said Diana on seeing Remy. "Well, madame, the duke has seen you." "And?" "And he says he loves you." "Loves me? But you are mad, Remy." "No, I tell you that that man, that wretch, Aurilly, told me so." "But then he recognized me?" "If he had, do you think that Aurilly would have dared to present himself and talk to you of love in the prince's name? No, he did not recognize you." "Yes, you must be right, Remy. So many things have passed during 6 years through that infernal brain that he has forgotten me. Let us follow this man." "But this man will recognize you." "Why should his memory be better than his master's?" "Oh, it is his business to remember, while it is the duke's to forget. How could he live if he did not forget? But Aurilly will not have forgotten. He will recognize you and will denounce you as an avenging shade." "Remy, I thought I told you I had a mask, and that you told me you had a knife." "It is true, madame, and I begin to think that God is assisting us to punish the wicked." Then, calling Aurilly from the top of the staircase, "Monsieur," said he. "Well?" replied Aurilly. "My mistress thanks Monsieur de Bouchage for having provided thus for her safety, and accepts with gratitude your obliging offer." "It is well," said Aurilly. "The horses are ready." "Come, madame, come," said Remy, offering his arm to Diana. Aurilly waited at the bottom of the staircase, lantern in hand, all anxiety to see the lady. "Diable!" murmured he, "she has a mask. But between this and Chateau Thierry the silk cords will be worn out or cut." End of chapter 75. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 76 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 76. The Journey. They set off. Aurilly affected the most perfect equality with Remy, and showed to Diana the greatest respect. But this respect was very interested. Indeed, to hold the stirrup of a woman when she mounts or dismounts
to watch each of her movements with solicitude, to let slip no occasion of picking up her glove, is the role either of a lover, a servant, or a spy. In touching Diana's glove, Aurilly saw her hand. In clasping her cloak, he peeped under her mask, and always did his utmost to see that face which the duke had not been able to recognize, but which he doubted not he should be able to. But Aurilly had to deal with one as skillful as himself. Remy claimed to perform his ordinary services to Diana, and seemed jealous of Aurilly, while Diana herself, without appearing to have any suspicions, begged Aurilly not to interfere with the services which her old attendant was accustomed to render her. Aurilly was then reduced to hoping for rain or sun to make her remove her mask, but neither rain nor sun had any effect, and whenever they stopped, Diana took her meals in her own room. Aurilly tried to look through keyholes, but Diana always sat with her back to the door. He tried to peep through the windows, but they were always thick curtains drawn, or, if none were there, cloaks were hung up to supply their place. Neither questions nor attempts at corruption succeeded with Remy, who always declared that his mistress's will was his. "But these precautions are then taken only on my account?" said Aurilly. "No, for everybody." "But Monsieur d'Anjou saw her; she was not hidden then." "Pure chance, but it is just because he did see her that she is more careful than ever." Days passed on, and they were nearing their destination, but Aurilly's curiosity had not been gratified. Already Picardy appeared to the eyes of the travelers. Aurilly began to lose patience, and the bad passions of his nature to gain the ascendant. He began to suspect some secret under all this mystery. One day he remained a little behind with Remy, and renewed his attempts at seduction, which Remy repulsed as usual. "But," said Aurilly, "some day or other I must see your mistress." "Doubtless," said Remy, "but that will be when she likes, and not when you like." "But if I employ force?" "Try," said Remy, while a lightning glance which he could not repress shot from his eyes. Aurilly tried to laugh. "What a fool I am," said he. "What does it matter to me who she is? She is the same person whom the duke saw." "Certainly." "And whom he told me to bring to Chateau Thierry?" "Yes." "Well, that is all that is necessary. It is not I who am in love with her, it is Monseigneur, and provided that you do not seek to escape or fly—" "Do we appear to wish to do so?" "No." "And she so little desires to do so, that, were you not here, we should continue our way to Chateau Thierry. If the duke wishes to see us, we wish also to see him." "That is capital," said Aurilly. "Would your mistress like to rest here a little while?" continued he, pointing to a hotel on the road. "You know," said Remy, "that my mistress never stops but in towns." "Well, I, who have made no such vow, will stop here a moment, ride on, and I will follow." Remy joined Diana.
"What was he saying?"
asked she.
"He expressed his constant desire—"
"To see me?"
"Yes."
Diana smiled.
"He is furious," continued Remy.
"He shall not see me, of that I am determined."
"But once we are at Chateau Thierry, must he not see your face?"
"What matter, if the discovery come too late? Besides, the duke did not recognize me."
"No, but his follower will. All these mysteries which have so annoyed Aurilly for 8 days had not existed for the prince. They had not excited his curiosity or awakened his souvenirs, while for a week Aurilly has been seeking, imagining, suspecting. Your face will strike on a memory fully awakened, and he will know you at once."
At this moment they were interrupted by Aurilly, who had taken a crossroad and come suddenly upon them, in the hope of surprising some words of their conversation. The sudden silence which followed his arrival proved to him that he was in the way, and he therefore rode behind them. He instinctively feared something, as Remy had said, but his floating conjectures never for an instant approached the truth. From this moment his plans were fixed, and in order to execute them the better, he changed his conduct, and showed himself the most accommodating and joyous companion possible during the rest of the day. Remy remarked this change not without anxiety. The next day they started early, and at noon were forced to stop to rest the horses. At 2 o'clock they set off again, and went on without stopping until 4. A great forest, that of La Fère, was visible in the distance. It had the sombre and mysterious aspect of our northern forests, so imposing to southern natures, to whom, beyond all things, heat and sunshine are necessary, but it was nothing to Remy and Diana, who were accustomed to the thick woods of Anjou and Sologne. It might have been about 6 o'clock in the evening when they entered the forest, and after half an hour's journey the sun began to go down. A high wind whirled about the leaves and carried them toward a lake, along the shore of which the travelers were journeying. Diana rode in the middle, Aurilly on the right, and Remy on the left. No other human being was visible under the somber arches of the trees. From the long extent of the road, one might have thought it one of those enchanted forests under whose shade nothing can live, had it not been for the hoarse howling of the wolves waking up at the approach of night. All at once Diana felt that her saddle, which had been put on by Aurilly, was slipping. She called Remy, who jumped down and began to tighten the girths. At this moment Aurilly approached Diana, and while she was occupied, cut the strings of silk which fastened her mask. Before she had divined the movement, or had time to put up her hand, Aurilly seized the mask and looked full at her. The eyes of these two people met with a look so terrible that no one could have said which looked most pale and menacing. Aurilly let the mask and his dagger fall, and clasping his hands, cried, "Heavens and earth! Madame de Montsoreau!" "It is a name which you shall repeat no more," cried Remy, seizing him by the girdle and dragging him from his horse. Both rolled on the ground together, and Aurilly stretched out his hand to reach his dagger. "No, Aurilly, no," said Remy, placing his knee on his breast. "La Hadouin!" cried Aurilly. "Oh, I am a dead man." "That is not yet true, but will be in a moment," cried Remy, and drawing his knife, he plunged the whole blade into the throat of the musician. Diana, with haggard eyes, half turned on her saddle, and leaning on the pommel, shuddering but pitiless, had not turned her head away from this terrible spectacle. However, when she saw the blood spurt out from the wound, she fell from her horse as though she were dead. Remy did not occupy himself with her at that terrible moment, but searched Aurilly, took from him the 2 rouleaux of gold, then tied a stone to the neck of the corpse, and threw it into the lake. He then washed his hands in the water, took in his arms Diana, who was still unconscious, and placed her again on her horse. That of Aurilly, frightened by the howling of the wolves, which began to draw nearer, had fled into the woods. When Diana recovered herself, she and Remy, without exchanging a single word, continued their route toward Chateau Thierry. End of chapter 76. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 77 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 77. How King Henri III did not invite Crillon to breakfast, and how Chicot invited himself. The day after the events that we have just related had taken place in the forest of La Fère, the King of France left his bath at about 9 in the morning. His valet de chambre, after having rolled him in a blanket of fine wool, and sponged him with that thick Persian wadding which looks like the fleece of a sheep, had given him over to the barbers and dressers, who in their turn gave place to the perfumers and courtiers. When these last were gone, the king sent for his maitre d'hotel, and ordered something more than his ordinary bouillon, as he felt hungry that morning. This good news spread joy throughout the Louvre, and the smell of viands was already beginning to be perceptible, when Crillon, colonel of the French guards, entered to take his majesty's order. "Ma foi, my good Crillon," said the king, "watch as you please over my safety, but do not force me to play the king. I am quite joyful and gay this morning, and feel as if I weighed but an ounce, and could fly away. I am hungry, Crillon. Do you understand that, my friend?" "I understand it very well, sire, for I am very hungry myself." "Oh, you, Crillon," said the king, laughing, "are always hungry." "Not always, sire. Your majesty exaggerates. Only 3 times a day." "And I about once a year, when I receive good news." "Harnebleu, it appears that you have received good news, sire. So much the better, for they become every day more rare." "Not at all, Crillon, but you know the proverb." Yes, no news are good news. I do not trust to proverbs, and above all to that one. You have no news from Navarre, then?" "None. A proof that there is nothing to tell." "And from Flanders?" "Nothing." "A proof that they are fighting. And from Paris?" "Nothing." "A proof that they are plotting." "But, Crillon, I believe I am going to have a child, for the queen dreamed so last night." "Well, I am happy to hear that your majesty is hungry this morning. Adieu, sire." "Go on, my good Crillon." "Harnebleu, sire, since your majesty is so hungry, you ought to invite me to breakfast with you."
Why so, Crillon? Because they say your majesty lives on air, and the air of the times is very bad. Now, I should have been happy to have been able to say, these are all pure calumnies. The king eats like everyone else. No, Crillon, no. Let me believe as they do. I do not wish to eat like a simple mortal. Remember this, Crillon. A king ought always to remain poetical, and only show himself in a noble position. Thus, for example, do you remember Alexander? What Alexander? Alexander Magnus. Ah, you do not know Latin, I remember. Well, King Alexander loved to bathe before his soldiers because he was so well made, handsome and plump that they compared him to Apollo, and even to Antinous. Oh, sire, you would be devilishly in the wrong to bathe before yours, for you are very thin, my poor king. Brave Crillon, go, said Henri, striking him on the shoulder. You are an excellent fellow, and do not flatter me. You are no courtier, my old friend. That is why you do not invite me to breakfast, replied Crillon, laughing good-humoredly, and taking his leave quite contentedly, for the tap on the shoulder consoled him for not getting the breakfast. When he was gone, the breakfast was laid at once. The maitre d'hotel had surpassed himself. A certain partridge soup, with a puree of truffles and chestnuts, attracted the king's attention, after he had eaten some fine oysters. Thus the ordinary broth, that faithful old friend of the king's, implored vainly from its golden basin, it attracted no attention. The king began to attack the partridge soup, and was at his fourth mouthful when a light step near him made the floor creak, and a well-known voice behind him said sharply, "A plate!" The king turned. "Chicot!" cried he. "Himself!" And Chicot, falling at once into his old habits, sat down in a chair, took a plate and a fork, and began on the oysters, picking out the finest without saying a word. "You here? You returned?" cried Henri. "Hush!" said Chicot with his mouth full, and he drew the soup toward him. "Stop, Chicot, that is my dish." Chicot divided it equally, and gave the king back half. Then he poured himself out some wine, passed from the soup to a pâté made of tunny fish, then to stuffed crab, swallowed as a finish the royal broth, then, with a great sigh, said, "I can eat no more." "Par l'amour Dieu, I hope not, Chicot." "Ah, good morning, my king. How are you? You seem to me very gay this morning." "Am I not, Chicot?" "You have quite a color. Is it your own?" "Parbleu!" "I compliment you on it." "The fact is, I feel very well this morning." "I am very glad of it. But have you no little tidbits left for breakfast?" "Here are cherries preserved by the ladies of Montmartre." "They are too sweet." "Nuts stuffed with raisins." "Bah! They have left the stones in the raisins." "You are not content with anything." "Well, really, on my word, everything degenerates, even cooking, and you begin to live very badly at your court." "Do they live better at that of the King of Navarre?" "Well, I do not say no." "Then there must be great changes." "Ah, you do not know how right you are." "Tell me about your journey. That will amuse me." "Willingly, that is what I came for. Where shall I begin?" "At the beginning. How did you make your journey?" "Oh, delightfully." "And met with no disagreeable adventures, no bad company?" "Oh, who would dream of annoying an ambassador of his most Christian Majesty? You calumniate your subjects, my son." "I asked," said the king, flattered by the tranquillity that reigned in his kingdom, "because you had no official character, and might have run some risk." "I tell you, Henriquet, that you have the most charming kingdom in the world. Travelers are nourished gratis, they are sheltered for the love of God, they walk on flowers, and as for the wheel ruts, they are carpeted with velvet and fringed with gold. It is incredible, but true." "Then you are content?" "Enchanted." "Yes, yes, my police is well organized." "Marvelously. I must do them justice." "And the road is safe?" "As that of paradise." "Chicot, we are returning to Virgil." "To what part?" "To the bucolics. O fortunatos nimium." "Ah, very well, but why this exception in favor of plowmen?" "Alas! because it is not the same in towns." "The fact is, Henri, that the towns are the centers of corruption." "Judge of it. You go 500 leagues without accident, while I go only to Vincennes, 3/4 of a league, and narrowly escape assassination by the way." "Oh, bah!" "I will tell you about it, my friend. I am having it written. Without my 45 guardsmen, I should have been a dead man."
"Truly? Where did it take place?"
"You mean, where was it to have taken place?"
"Yes."
"At Bel-Esbat."
"Near the convent of our friend Gorenflot?"
"Just so."
"And how did he behave under the circumstances?"
"Wonderfully, as usual, Chicot. I do not know if he had heard any rumor, but instead of snoring in bed, he was up in his balcony, while all his convent kept the road."
"And he did nothing else?"
"Who?"
"Dom Modeste."
"He blessed me with a majesty peculiar to himself, Chicot."
"And his monks?"
"Oh, they cried 'Vive le Roi' tremendously."
"And were they not armed?"
"They were completely armed, which was a wonderful piece of thoughtfulness on the part of the worthy prior. And yet this man has said nothing, and asked for nothing. He did not come the next day, like d'Epernon, to search my pockets, crying, 'Sire, something for having served the king.'"
"Oh, as for that, he is incapable of it. Besides, his hands would not go into your pockets."
"Chicot, no jests about Dom Modeste. He is one of the greatest men of my reign, and I declare that on the first opportunity I will give him a bishopric."
"And you will do well, my king."
"Remark one thing, Chicot, that a great man from the ranks of the people is complete. We gentlemen, you see, inherit in our blood certain vices and virtues. Thus the Valois are cunning and subtle, brave but idle. The Lorraines are ambitious, greedy, and intriguing. The Bourbons are sensual, without ideas, force, or will. Look at Henri. When nature, on the contrary, draws a great man from among the people, like Gorenflot, he is complete."
"You think so?"
"Yes, learned, modest, cunning, and brave. You could make of him what you liked, minister, general, or pope."
"Pray, stop, sire. If the brave man heard you, he would burst his skin, for, in spite of what you say, Dom Modeste is very vain."
"You are jealous, Chicot."
"I? Heaven forbid! Jealous?"
"I am but just. Noble blood does not blind me. Stemmata quid faciunt."
"Bravo! And you say then, Henri, that you were nearly assassinated?"
"Yes."
"By whom?"
"By the League, mordieu."
"How does the League get on?"
"Just the same."
"Which means that it grows daily?"
"Oh, political bodies never live which grow big too young. They are like children, Chicot."
"Then you are content, my son?"
"Nearly so."
"You are happy?"
"Yes, Chicot, and I am very glad to see you return."
"Habamus consulum facitum," as Cato said.
"You bring good news, do you not?"
"I should think so."
"You keep me in suspense."
"Where shall I begin?"
"I have already said, from the beginning, but you always wander from the point. You say that the journey was good?"
"You see I have returned whole."
"Yes, then let me hear of your arrival in Navarre. What was Henri doing when you arrived?"
"Making love."
"To Margot?"
"Oh, no."
"It would have astonished me had it been so. He is always unfaithful to his wife, the rascal, unfaithful to a daughter of France. Luckily, she pays him back. And when you arrived, what was the name of Margot's rival?"
"Fosseuse."
"A Montmorency? Come, that is not so bad for a bear of Béarn. They spoke here of a peasant, a gardener's daughter."
"Oh, that is very old."
"Then he is faithless to Margot."
"As much as possible."
"And she is furious?"
"Enraged."
"And she revenges herself?"
"I believe so."
Henri rubbed his hands joyfully. "What will she do?" cried he. "Will she move heaven and earth, bring Spain on Navarre, Artois and Flanders on Spain? Will she call in her little brother Henriquet against her husband Henri?"
"It is possible."
"You saw her?"
"Yes."
"Then they execrate each other?"
"I believe that in their hearts they do not adore each other."
But in appearance.
They are the best friends in the world.
Yes, but some fine morning some new love will embroil them completely.
Well, this new love has come.
Bah!
Yes, on my honor. But shall I tell you what I fear?
Yes.
That this new love, instead of embroiling, will reconcile them.
Then there is a new love, really?
Oh, mon Dieu, yes.
Of Henri's?
Of Henri's.
For whom?
You wish to know all, do you not?
Yes, Chicot, tell me all about it.
Well, my son, then I must go back to the beginning.
Go back, but be quick.
You wrote a letter to the Béarnais.
Well?
And I read it.
What did you think of it?
That if it was not delicate, at least it was cunning.
It ought to have embroiled them.
Yes, if Henri and Margot had been an ordinary, commonplace couple.
What do you mean?
I mean that Henri is no fool.
Oh.
And that he guessed.
Guessed what?
That you wished to make him quarrel with his wife.
That was clear.
Yes, but what was less clear was your object in doing so.
Ah, diable, the object.
Yes, this Béarnais thought your aim was to make him quarrel with his wife, that you might not have to pay her dowry.
Oh.
Mon Dieu, yes, that is what got into the head of that devil of a Béarnais.
Go on, Chicot,
said the king, beginning to look annoyed. Well, scarcely had he guessed that, then he became what you look now, sad and melancholy, so much so that he hardly thought of Fosseuse.
Bah!
Yes, really, and then he conceived that other love I told you of.
But this man is a Turk, a pagan, and what did Margot say?
This time, my son, you will be astonished. Margot was delighted.
But what is the name of this new mistress?
Oh, she is a beautiful and strong person, capable of defending herself if she is attacked.
And did she defend herself?
Oh, yes.
So that Henri was repulsed?
At first.
And afterward?
Oh, Henri is persevering, and he returned to the charge.
So that
he won her.
How?
By petards.
What the devil are you talking about?
The truth.
Petards? Who is this belle that is taken with petards?
It is Mademoiselle Cahors.
Mademoiselle Cahors?
Yes, a large and beautiful girl who has one foot on the Got and the other on the hills, and whose guardian is, or rather was, Monsieur de Vassin, a brave gentleman of my acquaintance.
Mordieu! Cried Henri furiously. My city! He has taken my city!
Why, you see, Henri, you would not give it to him, and he was obliged to take it, but apropos, here is a letter that he asked me to deliver into your own hand. And Chicot, drawing out a letter, gave it to the king. It was the one Henri had written after taking Cahors, and it finished with these words: Quod mihi desisti profuit multum, cognosco meus devotos, nosce tuos, Chicotus cetera expediet. Which meant, what you told me was very useful. I know my friends, know yours. Chicot will tell you the rest. End of chapter 77. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 78 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 78. How, after receiving news from the south, Henri received news from the north. The king, highly exasperated, could hardly read the letter which Chicot gave to him. While he deciphered the Latin with every sign of impatience, Chicot, before a great Venetian mirror which hung over a gilt table, was admiring the infinite grace of his own person under his military dress.
"Oh, I am betrayed!" cried Henri when he had finished the letter. "The Béarnais had a plan, and I never suspected it."
"My son," said Chicot, "you know the proverb, 'Still waters run deepest'?"
"Go to the devil with your proverbs!"
Chicot went to the door as if to obey.
"No, remain."
Chicot stopped.
Cahors taken, continued Henri.
Yes, and very well done, too.
Then he has generals and engineers?
No, he is too poor for that. He could not pay them. He does it all himself.
He fight?
Said Henri disdainfully. I do not say that he rushes into it with enthusiasm. No, he resembles those people who try the water before they bathe. He just dips the ends of his fingers with a little shudder, which augurs badly, then his breast. All this takes him about 10 minutes. Then he rushes into action and through fire, like a salamander.
Diable!
And I assure you, Henri, the fire was hot there. The king rose and walked up and down the room.
Here is a misfortune for me, cried he. They will laugh at it. They will sing about it, mordieu! It is lucky I thought of sending the promised aid to Antwerp. Antwerp will compensate for Cahors. The North will blot out the South.
Amen, said Chicot, plunging his hands into the king's sweetmeat box to finish his dessert. At this moment the door opened, and the usher announced Monsieur le Comte de Bouchage.
Ah, cried Henri, I told you so. Here are news. Enter, Comte, enter.
The usher opened the door, and Henri de Bouchage entered slowly and bent a knee to the king.
Still pale and sad, said the king. Come, my friend, take a holiday air for a little while, and do not tell me good news with a doleful face. Speak quickly, de Bouchage, for I want to hear. You come from Flanders?
Yes, sire.
And quickly?
As quickly, sire, as a man can ride.
You are welcome. And now, what of Antwerp?
Antwerp belongs to the Prince of Orange.
To the Prince of Orange?
Yes, to William.
But did not my brother attack Antwerp?
Yes, sire, but now he is traveling to Chateau Thierry.
He has left the army?
Sire, there is no longer an army.
Oh, cried the king, sinking back in his armchair. But Joyeuse?
Sire, my brother, after having done wonders with his sailors, after having conducted the whole of the retreat, rallied the few men who escaped the disaster, and sent me home with an escort for Monsieur le Duc d'Anjou.
A defeat,
murmured the king, but all at once, with a strange look.
Then Flanders is lost to my brother?
Absolutely, sire.
Without hope?
I fear so, sire. The clouds gradually cleared from the king's brow.
That poor Francois, said he, smiling. He is unlucky in his search for a crown. He missed that of Navarre. He has stretched out his hand for that of England, and has touched that of Flanders. I would wager, du Bouchage, that he will never reign, although he desires it so much. And how many prisoners were taken?
About 2,000.
How many killed?
At least as many, and among them Monsieur de Saint-Aignan.
What? Poor Saint-Aignan dead?
Drowned.
Drowned? Did you throw yourselves into the Scheldt?
No, the Scheldt threw itself upon us. The comte then gave the king a description of the battle and of the inundations. Henri listened silently. When the recital was over, he rose, and kneeling down on his prie-dieu, said some prayers, and then returned with a perfectly calm face.
Well, said he, I trust I bear things like a king, and you, Comte, since your brother is saved, like mine, thank God and smile a little.
Sire, I am at your orders.
What do you ask as payment for your services, du Bouchage?
Sire, I have rendered no service.
I dispute that, but at least your brother has.
Immense, sire.
He has saved the army, you say, or rather its remnants?
There is not a man left who does not say that he owes his life to my brother.
Well, du Bouchage, my will is to extend my benefits to both, and I only imitate in that him who made you both rich, brave, and handsome. Besides, I should imitate those great politicians who always rewarded the bearers of bad news.
Oh, said Chicot, I have known men hung for bringing bad news.
That is possible, said the king, but remember the Senate that thanked Ferron.
You cite Republicans, Valois. Misfortune makes you humble.
Come, du Bouchage, what will you have? What would you like?
Since your majesty does me the honor to speak to me so kindly, I will dare to profit by your goodness. I am tired of life, sire, and yet have a repugnance to shortening it myself. For God forbids it, and all the subterfuges that a man of honor employs in such a case are mortal sins.
To get oneself killed in battle, or to let oneself die of hunger, are only different forms of suicide. I renounce the idea, therefore, of dying before the term which God has fixed for my life, and yet the world fatigues me, and I must leave it." "My friend," said the king. Chicot looked with interest at the young man, so beautiful, so brave, so rich, and yet speaking in this desponding tone. "Sire," continued the comte, "everything that has happened to me for some time has strengthened my resolution. I wish to throw myself into the arms of God, who is the sovereign consoler of the afflicted, as he is of the happy. Deign then, sire, to facilitate my entrance into a religious life, for my heart is sad unto death." The king was moved at this doleful request. "Ah, I understand," said he. "You wish to become a monk, but you fear the probation." "I do not fear the austerity, sire, but the time they leave one in indecision. It is not to soften my life, nor to spare my body any physical suffering, or my mind any moral privation, but it is to pass at once from this world to the grating which separates me from it, and which one generally attains so slowly." "Poor boy," said the king. "I think he will make a good preacher, will he not, Chicot?" Chicot did not reply, and Du Bouchage continued. "You see, sire, that it is with my own family that the struggle will take place, and with my relations that I shall meet with the greatest opposition. My brother, the cardinal, at once so good and so worldly, will fill 1,000 reasons to persuade me against it. At Rome, your majesty is all powerful. You have asked me for what I wish for, and promised to grant it. My wish is this: obtain from Rome an authority that my novitiate can be dispensed with." The king rose smiling, and taking the comte's hand, said, "I will do what you ask, my son. You wish to serve God, and you are right. He is a better master than I am. You have my promise, dear comte." "Your majesty overwhelms me with joy," cried the young man, kissing Henri's hand as though he had made him duke, peer, or marshal of France. "Then it is settled?" "On my word as a king and a gentleman." Something like a smile passed over the lips of Du Bouchage. He bowed respectfully to the king and took leave. "What a happy young man," said Henri. "Oh," said Chicot, "you need not envy him. He is not more doleful than yourself." "But, Chicot, he is going to give himself up to religion." "And who the devil prevents you from doing the same? I know a cardinal who will give all necessary aid, and he has more interest at Rome than you have. Do you not know him? I mean the Cardinal de Guise." "Chicot!" "Oh, if the tonsure disquiets you, for it is rather a delicate operation, the prettiest hands and the prettiest scissors, golden scissors, ma foi, will give you this precious symbol, which would raise to 3 the number of the crowns you have worn, and will justify the device, Manet ultima coelo." "Pretty hands, do you say?" "Yes. Do you mean to abuse the hands of Madame de Montpensier? How severe you are upon your subjects." The king frowned, and passed over his eyes a hand as white as those spoken of, but more trembling. "Well," said Chicot, "let us leave that, for I see that the conversation does not please you, and let us return to subjects that interest me personally." The king made a gesture, half indifferent, half approving. "Have you heard, Henri," continued Chicot, "whether those Joyeuses carried off any woman?" "Not that I know of." "Have they burned anything?" "What?" "How should I know what a great lord burns to amuse himself? The house of some poor devil, perhaps." "Are you mad, Chicot? Burn a house for amusement in my city of Paris?" "Oh, why not?" "Chicot!" "Then they have done nothing that you know of?" "Ma foi, no." "Oh, so much the better," said Chicot, drawing a long breath like a man much relieved. "Do you know one thing, Chicot?" said Henri. "No, I do not." "It is that you have become wicked." "I?" "Yes, you." "My sojourn into the tomb had sweetened me, but your presence, great king, has destroyed the effect." "You become insupportable, Chicot. Now I attribute to you some ambitious projects and intrigues of which I formerly believed you incapable." "Projects of ambition? I ambitious? Henriquet, my son, you used to be only foolish, now you are mad. You have progressed." "And I tell you, Monsieur Chicot, that you wish to separate from me all my old friends, by attributing to them intentions which they have not, and crimes of which they never thought. In fact, you wish to monopolize me." "I monopolize you? What for? God forbid! You are too tiresome, without counting the difficulty of pleasing you with your food. Oh, no, indeed. Explain to me whence comes this strange idea." "You began by listening coldly to my praises of your old friend, Dame Modeste, to whom you owe so much." "I owe much to Dame Modeste? Good. Then you tried to calumniate the Joyeuses, my true friends." "I do not say no." "Then you launched a shaft at the Guises." "Ha! You love them now. You love all the world today, it seems." "No, I do not love them. But as just now they keep themselves close and quiet, and do not do me the least harm, I do not fear them, and I cling to all old and well-known faces. All these Guises, with their fierce looks and great swords, have never done me any harm, after all, and they resemble—shall I tell you what?" "Do, Henry. I know how clever you are at comparisons." "They resemble those perch that they let loose in the ponds to chase the great fish, and prevent them growing too fat. But suppose that the great fish are not afraid." "Well?" "Then the teeth of the perch are not strong enough to get through their scales." "Oh, Henry, my friend, how clever you are!" "While your Baronese—" "Well, you have a comparison for him also?" "While your Baronese, who mews like a cat, bites like a tiger." "Well, my son, I will tell you what to do. Divorce the queen and marry Madame de Montpensier. Was she not once in love with you?" "Yes, and that is the source of all her menaces, Chicot. She has a woman's spite against me, and she provokes me now and then, but luckily I am a man, and can laugh at it." As Henry finished these words, the usher cried at the door, "A messenger from Monsieur le Duc de Guise for his Majesty." "Is it a courier or a gentleman?" asked the king. "It is a captain, sire." "Let him enter. He is welcome." End of chapter 78. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 79 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 79. The Two Companions. Chicot at this announcement sat down and turned his back to the door, but the first words pronounced by the duke's messenger made him start. He opened his eyes, and the messenger could see nothing but the eye of Chicot peering from behind the chair, while Chicot could see him altogether. "You come from Lorraine?" asked the king of the newcomer, who had a fine and warlike appearance. "Not so, sire. I come from Soissons, where Monsieur le Duc, who has been a month in that city, gave me this letter to deliver to your Majesty." The messenger then opened his buff coat, which was fastened by silver clasps, and drew from a leather pouch lined with silk not one letter but two, for they had stuck together by the wax, and as the captain advanced to give the king one letter, the other fell on the carpet. Chicot's eyes followed the messenger and saw the color spread over his cheeks as he stooped to pick up the letter he had let fall. But Henri saw nothing. He opened his own letter and read, while the messenger watched him closely. "Ah, Monsieur Borromée," thought Chicot, "so you are a captain, are you?" "Good," said the king, after reading the duke's letter with evident satisfaction. "Go, captain, and tell Monsieur de Guise that I am grateful for his offer." "Your Majesty will not honor me with a written answer?" "No, I shall see the duke in a month or 6 weeks, and can thank him myself." The captain bowed and went out. "You see, Chicot," then said the king, "that Monsieur de Guise is free from all machinations. This brave duke has learned the Navarre business, and he fears that the Huguenots will raise up their heads, for he has also ascertained that the Germans are about to send reinforcements to Henri. Now, guess what he is about to do." As Chicot did not reply, Henri went on. "Well, he offers me the army that he has just raised in Lorraine to watch Flanders, and says that in 6 weeks it will be at my command with its general. What do you say to that, Chicot?" No answer. "Really, my dear Chicot," continued the king, "you are as absurdly obstinate as a Spanish mule, and if I happen to convince you of some error, you sulk. Yes, sulk." Not a sound came to contradict Henri in this frank opinion of his friend. Now silence displeased Henri more than contradiction. "I believe," said he, "that the fellow has had the impertinence to go to sleep. Chicot," continued he, advancing to the armchair, "reply when your king speaks."
But Chicot did not reply, for he was not there, and Henri found the armchair empty. He looked all round the room, but Chicot was not to be seen. The king gave a superstitious shudder. It sometimes came into his mind that Chicot was a supernatural being, a diabolic incarnation, of a good kind, it was true, but still diabolical. He called Nambu the usher, and questioned him, and he assured his majesty that he had seen Chicot go out 5 minutes before the duke's messenger left. Decidedly, thought Henri, Chicot was vexed at being in the wrong. How ill-natured men are, even the best of them. Nambu was right. Chicot had traversed the antechambers silently, but still was not able to keep his spurs from sounding, which made several people turn and bow when they saw who it was. The captain came out 5 minutes after Chicot, went down the steps across the court proudly and with a satisfied air, proud of his person and pleased that the king had received him so well, and without any suspicions of Monsieur de Guise. As he crossed the drawbridge, he heard behind him steps which seemed to be the echo of his own. He turned, thinking that the king had sent some message to him, and great was his stupefaction to see behind him the demure face of Robert Briquet. It may be remembered that the first feeling of these two men about one another had not been exactly sympathetical. Borromée opened his mouth and paused, and in an instant was joined by Chicot.
"Corboeuf,"
said Borromée. "Ventre de biche!" cried Chicot.
"The bourgeois."
"The reverend father."
"With that helmet."
"With that buff coat."
"I am surprised to see you."
"I am delighted to meet you again." And they looked fiercely at each other, but Borromée, quickly assuming an air of amiable urbanity, said,
"Vive Dieu, you are cunning, Monsieur Robert Briquet."
"I, reverend father, and why do you say so?"
"When you were at the convent of the Jacobins, you made me believe you were only a simple bourgeois."
"Ah," replied Chicot, "and what must we say of you, Monsieur Borromée?"
"Of me?"
"Yes, of you."
"And why?"
"For making me believe you were only a monk. You must be more cunning than the Pope himself, but you took me in the snare."
"The snare?"
"Yes, doubtless a brave captain like you does not change his cuirass for a frock without grave reasons."
"With a soldier like you I have no secrets. It is true that I have certain personal interests in the convent of the Jacobins, but you?"
"And I also."
"Let us chat about it."
"I am quite ready."
"Do you like wine?"
"Yes, when it is good."
"Well, I know a little inn which I think has no rivals in Paris."
"And I know one also. What is yours called?"
"The Corne dAbondance."
"Ah."
"Well, what is it?"
"Nothing."
"Do you know anything against this house?"
"Not at all."
"You know it?"
"No, and that astonishes me."
"Shall we go there, compere?"
"Oh, yes, at once."
"Come then."
"Where is it?"
"Near the Porte Bourdelle. The host appreciates well the difference between palates like yours and mine, and those of every thirsty passer-by."
"Can we talk there?"
"Perfectly, at our ease."
"Oh, I see you are well known there."
"Ma foi, no, this time you are wrong. Monsieur Bonhomme sells me wine when I want it, and I pay when I can. That is all."
"Bonhomme, that is a name that promises well."
"And keeps its promise. Come, compere."
"Oh, oh," said Chicot to himself, "now I must choose among my best grimaces, for if Bonhomme recognizes me at once, it is all over." End of chapter 79. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 80 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 80. The Corne dAbondance. The way along which Borromée led Chicot, never suspecting that he knew it as well as himself, recalled to our Gascon the happy days of his youth. How many times had he in those days, under the rays of the winter sun, or in the cool shade in summer, sought out this house, toward which a stranger was now conducting him. Then a few pieces of gold, or even of silver, jingling in his purse, made him happier than a king, and he gave himself up to the delightful pleasures of laziness, having no wife nor children starving, or scolding, or suspicious at home. Then Chicot used to sit down carelessly on the wooden bench, waiting for Gorenflot, who, however, was always exact to the time fixed for dinner, and then he used to study with intelligent curiosity Gorenflot in all his different shades of drunkenness. Soon the great street of Saint Jacques appeared to his eyes, the cloister of Saint Benoit, and nearly in front of the hotel of the Corne dAbondance, rather dirty and rather dilapidated, but still shaded by its planes and chestnuts, and embellished inside by its pots of shining copper and brilliant saucepans, looking like imitations of gold and silver, and bringing real gold and silver into the pockets of the innkeeper. Chicot bent his back until he seemed to lose 5 or 6 inches of his height, and making a most hideous grimace, prepared to meet his old friend Bonhomet. However, as Bonhomet walked first, it was to him that Bonhomet spoke, and he scarcely looked at Chicot, who stood behind. Time had left its traces on the face of Bonhomet, as well as on his house. Besides the wrinkles which seemed to correspond on the human face to the cracks made by time on the front of buildings, Monsieur Bonhomet had assumed airs of great importance since Chicot had seen him last. These, however, he never showed much to men of a warlike appearance, for whom he had always a great respect. It seemed to Chicot that nothing was changed, excepting the tint of the ceiling, which from gray had turned to black.
"Come, friend," said Bonhomet, "I know a little nook where 2 men may talk at their ease while they drink. Is it empty?" continued he, turning to Bonhomet.
Bonhomet answered that it was, and Bonhomet then led Chicot to the little room already so well known to all readers of Chicot the Jester.
"Now," said Bonhomet, "wait here for me while I avail myself of a privilege granted to the habitués of this house."
"What is that?"
"To go to the cellar and fetch one's own wine."
"Ah, a jolly privilege. Go, then." Bonhomet went out. Chicot watched him disappear, and then went to the wall and raised a picture representing credit killed by bad paymasters, behind which was a hole, through which you could see into the public room. Chicot knew this hole well, for it was his own making. On looking through, he perceived Bonhomet, after placing his finger on his lips, a sign of caution, say something to Bonhomet, who seemed to acquiesce by a nod of the head, after which Bonhomet took a light, which was always kept burning in readiness, and descended to the cellar. Then Chicot knocked on the wall in a peculiar manner. On hearing this knock, which seemed to recall to him some souvenir deeply rooted in his heart, Bonhomet started and looked round him. Chicot knocked again impatiently, like a man angry at his first call not being answered. Bonhomet ran to the little room and found Chicot standing there upright. At this sight, Bonhomet, who like the rest of the world had believed Chicot dead, uttered a cry, for he believed he saw a ghost. "Since when," said Chicot, "has a person like me been obliged to call twice?" "Oh, dear Monsieur Chicot, is it you or your shade?" cried Bonhomet. "Whichever it be, since you recognize me, I hope you will obey me." "Oh, certainly, dear Monsieur Chicot." "Then whatever noise you hear in this room, and whatever takes place here, do not come until I call you." "Your directions will be the easier to obey, since they are exactly the same as your companion has just given to me." "Yes, but if he calls, do not come. Wait until I call." "I will, Monsieur Chicot." "Good. Now send away everyone else from your inn, and in 10 minutes let us be as free as solitary here as if we came to fast on Good Friday." "In 10 minutes, Monsieur Chicot, there shall not be a soul in the hotel, excepting your humble servant." "Go, Bonhomet, you are not changed, I see." "Oh, mon Dieu, mon Dieu," said Bonhomet as he retired. "What is about to take place at my poor house?" As he went, he met Bonhomet returning from the cellar with his bottles. We do not know how Bonhomet managed, but when the 10 minutes had expired, the last customer was crossing the threshold of the door, muttering, "Oh, the weather is stormy here today. We must avoid the storm." End of chapter 80. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 81 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 81. What happened in the little room? When the captain re-entered the room with a basket in his hand containing a dozen bottles, he was received by Chicot with smiles. Bonhomet was in haste to uncork his bottles, but his haste was nothing to Chicot's. Thus the preparations did not take long, and the 2 companions began to drink. At first, as though their occupation was too important to be interrupted, they drank in silence. Chicot uttered only these words: "Par ma foi, this is good Burgundy." They drank 2 bottles in this way. At the third, Chicot raised his eyes to heaven and said, Really, we are drinking as though we wished to intoxicate ourselves."
"It is good,"
replied Borromée. "Ah, it pleases you. Go on, friend, I have a strong head." And each of them swallowed another bottle. The wine produced on each of them an opposite effect. It unloosened Chicot's tongue and tied that of Borromée. "Ah," murmured Chicot, "you are silent, then you doubt yourself."
"Ah," said
Borromée to himself,
"you chatter, then you are getting tipsy."
Then he asked Chicot,
"How many bottles does it take you?"
"For what?"
"To get lively."
"About 4."
"And to get tipsy?"
"About 6."
"And dead drunk?"
"Double."
"Boaster," thought Borromée. "He stammers already and has only drunk 4. Come, then, we can go on,"
said he, and he drew out a 5th for Chicot and one for himself. But Chicot remarked that of the 5 bottles ranged beside Borromée, some were half full and others 2/3, none were empty. This confirmed him in his suspicions that the captain had bad intentions with regard to him. He rose as if to fetch his 5th bottle, and staggered as he did so. "Oh," said he, "did you feel—"
"What?"
"The earth trembling."
"Bah!"
"Yes, ventre de biche! Luckily the hotel of the Corne dAbondance is solid, although it is built on a pivot."
"What? Built on a pivot?"
"Doubtless, since it turns."
"True," said Borromée. "I felt the effects, but did not guess the cause."
"Because you are not a Latin scholar and have not read the De Natura Rerum. If you had, you would know that there is no effect without a cause."
"Well, my dear captain, for you are a captain like me, are you not?"
"Yes, from the points of my toes to the roots of my hair."
"Well, then, my dear captain, tell me, since there is no effect without a cause, as you say, what was the cause of your disguise?"
"What disguise?"
"That which you wore when you came to visit Dame Modeste."
"How was I disguised?"
"As a bourgeois."
"Ah, true."
"Will you tell me?"
"Willingly, if you will tell me why you were disguised as a monk. Confidence for confidence."
"Agreed," said Borromée.
"You wish to know then why I was disguised?" said Chicot, with an utterance which seemed to grow thicker and thicker.
"Yes, it puzzles me."
"And then you will tell me?"
"Yes, that was agreed."
"Ah, true. I forgot. Well, the thing is very simple. I was a spy for the king."
"A spy?"
"Yes."
"Is that then your profession?"
"No, I am an amateur."
"What were you spying there?"
"Everyone. Dame Modeste himself, then Brother Borromée, little Jacques, and the whole convent."
"And what did you discover, my friend?"
"First, that Dame Modeste is a great fool."
"It does not need to be very clever to find that out."
"Pardon me, His Majesty Henri III, who is no fool, regards him as one of the lights of the church, and is about to make a bishop of him."
"So be it. I have nothing to say against that promotion. On the contrary, it will give me a good laugh. But what else did you discover?"
"I discovered that Brother Borromée was not a monk, but a captain."
"Ah, you discovered that?"
"At once."
"Anything else?"
"I discovered that Jacques was practicing with the foils before he began with the sword."
"Ah, you discovered that also. Anything else?"
"Give me more to drink, or I shall remember nothing."
"Remember that you are beginning your 6th bottle,"
said Borromée, laughing. "Did we not come here to drink?"
"Certainly we did."
"Then let us drink."
"Well,"
said Borromée,
"now do you remember?"
"What?"
"What else you saw in the convent?"
"Well, I saw that the monks were really soldiers, and instead of obeying Dame Modeste, obeyed you."
"Ah, truly, but doubtless that was not all."
"No, but more to drink, or my memory will fail me." And as his bottle was empty, he held out his glass for more.
"Well, now do you remember?" "Oh, yes, I should think so." "Well, what else?" "I saw there was a plot." "A plot?" cried Borromée, turning pale. "Yes, a plot." "Against whom?" "Against the king." "Of what nature?" "To try and carry him off." "When?" "When he was returning from Vincennes." "Sacre!" "What did you say?" "Nothing. And you found out that?" "Yes." "And warned the king?" "Parbleu! That was what I came for." "Then you were the cause of the attempt failing?" "Yes, I." "Hang him," murmured Borromée. "Oh, what did you say?" "I said that you have good eyes, my friend." "Bah! I have seen more than that. Pass me one of your bottles, and I will tell you what I have seen." Borromée hastened to comply with Chicot's desire. "Let me hear," said he. "Firstly, I have seen Monsieur de Mayenne wounded." "Bah!" "No wonder; he was on my route. And then I have seen the taking of Cahors." "How? The taking of Cahors?" "Certainly. Ah, captain, it was a grand thing to see, and a brave man like you would have been delighted." "I do not doubt it. You were then near the King of Navarre?" "Side by side, my friend, as we are now." "And you left him?" "To announce this news to the King of France." "Then you have been at the Louvre?" "Yes, just before you." "Then, as we have not quitted each other since, I need not ask you what you have done." "On the contrary, ask, for that is the most curious of all." "Tell me, then." "Tell? Oh, it is very easy to say tell." "Try." "One more glass of wine, then, to loosen my tongue. Quite full, that will do. Well, I saw, comrade, that when you gave the king the Duc de Guise's letter, you let another fall." "Another?" cried Borromée, starting up. "Yes, it is there." And having tried 2 or 3 times with an unsteady hand, he put his finger on the buff doublet of Borromée, just where the letter was. Borromée started as though Chicot's finger had been a hot iron and had touched his skin instead of his doublet. "Oh," said he, "there is but one thing wanting." "What is that?" "That you should know to whom the letter is addressed." "Oh, I know quite well. It is addressed to the Duchesse de Montpensier." "Good heavens! I hope you have not told that to the king." "No, but I will tell him." "When?" "When I have had a nap." And he let his arms fall on the table, and his head on them. "Then, as soon as you can walk, you will go to the Louvre?" "I will." "You will denounce me?" "I will denounce you." "Is it not a joke?" "What?" "That you will tell the king after your nap?" "Not at all. You see, my dear friend," said Chicot, half raising his head, "you are a conspirator, and I am a spy. You have a plot, and I denounce you. We each follow our business." And Chicot laid his head down again, so that his face was completely hidden by his hands, while the back of his head was protected by his helmet.
"Ah!" cried Borromée, "you will denounce me when you wake?"
And rising, he made a furious blow with his dagger on the back of his companion, thinking to pierce him through and nail him to the table. But he had not reckoned on the shirt of mail which Chicot had carried away from the priory. The dagger broke upon it like glass, and for the second time Chicot owed his life to it. Before Borromée had time to recover from his astonishment, Chicot's right fist struck him a heavy blow in the face, and sent him bleeding and stunned against the wall. In a minute, however, he was up and sword in hand, but this minute had sufficed for Chicot to draw his sword also, and prepare himself. He seemed to shake off, as if by enchantment, all the fumes of the wine, and stood with a steady hand to receive his adversary. The table, like a field of battle, covered with empty bottles, lay between them, but the blood flowing down his face infuriated Borromée, who lunged at his adversary as fiercely as the intervening table permitted. "Dolt!" cried Chicot, "you see that it is decidedly you who are drunk, for you cannot reach me across the table, while my arm is 6 inches longer than yours, and my sword as much longer than your sword, and here is the proof." As he spoke, he stretched out his arm and wounded Borromée in the forehead. Borromée uttered a cry, still more of rage than of pain, and, as he was brave enough, attacked with double fury. Chicot, however, still on the other side of the table, took a chair and sat down, saying, "Mon Dieu, how stupid these soldiers are! They pretend to know how to manage their swords, and any bourgeois, if he liked, could kill them like flies. Ah, now you want to put out my eye, and now you mount on the table, but ventre de biche! Take care, donkey!" And he pricked him with his sword in the stomach, as he had already done in the forehead. Borromée roared with anger and leaped from the table to the floor. "That is as it should be," said Chicot. "Now we are on the same level, and we can talk while we are fencing. Ha, captain, captain! And so we sometimes try our hand a little at assassination in our spare moments, do we?"
"I do for my cause what you do for yours,"
said Borromée, now brought back to the seriousness of his position, and terrified, in spite of himself, at the smothered fire which seemed gleaming in Chicot's eyes. "So much for talking," said Chicot. "And yet, my friend, it is with no little pleasure I find that I am a better hand than you are. Ah, that was not bad." Borromée had just made a lunge at Chicot, which had slightly touched his breast. "Not bad, but I know a thrust. It is the very same you showed little Jacques. I was just saying, then, that I have the advantage of you, for I did not begin this quarrel, however anxiously disposed I might have been to do so. More than that, even, I have allowed you to carry out your project by giving you every latitude you required, and yet, at this very moment even, I have only been acting on the defensive, and this because I have something to propose to you."
"Nothing!"
cried Borromée, exasperated at Chicot's imperturbability.
"Nothing!"
And he gave a thrust which would have run the Gascon completely through the body if the latter had not, with his long legs, sprung back a step, which placed him out of his adversary's reach. "I am going to tell you what this arrangement is, all the same, so that I shall have nothing left to reproach myself for."
"Hold your tongue," said Borromée. "Hold your tongue. It will be useless."
"Listen," said Chicot. "It is to satisfy my own conscience. I have no wish to shed your blood, you understand, and I don't want to kill you until I am driven to extremes."
Kill me, I say, if you can!"
exclaimed Borromée, exasperated. "No, no, I have already once in my life killed another such swordsman as you are. I will even say a better swordsman than you. Pardieu, you know him. He, too, was one of the de Guises' retainers. A lawyer, too."
"Ah, Nicolas David!"
said Borromée, terrified at the incident, and again placing himself on the defensive. "Exactly so."
"It was you who killed him?"
"Oh, yes, with a pretty little thrust which I will presently show you, if you decline the arrangement I propose."
"Well, let me hear what the arrangement is."
"You will pass from the Duc de Guise's service to that of the king, without, however, quitting that of the duke."
"In other words, that I should become a spy like yourself?"
"No, for there will be a difference. I am not paid, but you will be. You will begin by showing me the Duc de Guise's letter to Madame la Duchesse de Montpensier. You will let me take a copy of it, and I will leave you quiet until another occasion. Well, am I not considerate?"
"Here," said Borromée, "is my answer."
Borromée's reply was un coupé sur les armes, so rapidly dealt that the point of his sword slightly touched Chicot's shoulder. "Well, well," said Chicot, "I see I must positively show you Nicolas David's thrust. It is very simple and pretty." And Chicot, who had up to that moment been acting on the defensive, made one step forward and attacked in his turn. "This is the thrust," said Chicot. "I make a feint in quatre bas." And he did so. Borromée parried by giving way, but after this first step backward, he was obliged to stop, as he found that he was close to the partition. "Good, precisely so. You parry in a circle. That's wrong, for my wrist is stronger than yours. I catch your sword in mine, thus. I return to the attack by a fierce halt. I fall upon you, so, and you are hit, or rather, you are a dead man." In fact, the thrust had followed, or rather had accompanied, the demonstration, and the slender rapier penetrating Borromée's chest had glided like a needle completely through him, penetrating deeply, and with a dull, heavy sound, the wooden partition behind him. Borromée flung out his arms, letting his sword fall to the ground. His eyes became fixed and injected with blood. His mouth opened wide, his lips were stained with a red-colored foam. His head fell on his shoulder with a sigh which sounded like a death rattle. Then his limbs refused their support, and his body, as it sunk forward, enlarged the aperture of the wound, but could not free itself from the partition, supported as it was by Chicot's terrible wrist, so that the miserable wretch, like a gigantic insect, remained fastened to the wall, which his feet kicked convulsively. Chicot, cold and impassible, as he always was in positions of great difficulty, especially when he had a conviction at the bottom of his heart that he had done everything his conscience could require of him, Chicot, we say, took his hand from his sword, which remained in a horizontal position, unfastened the captain's belt, searched his doublet, took the letter, and read the address: Duchesse de Montpensier. All this time the blood was welling copiously from the wound, and the agony of death was depicted on the features of the wounded man.
"I am dying! I am dying!" he murmured. "Oh, heaven, have pity on me!"
This last appeal to the divine mercy, made by a man who had most probably rarely thought of it until this moment of his direst need, touched Chicot's feeling. "Let us be charitable," he said, "and since this man must die, let him at least die as quietly as possible." He then advanced toward the partition, and by an effort withdrew his sword from the wall, and supporting Borromée's body, he prevented it from falling heavily to the ground. This last precaution, however, was useless. The approach of death had been rapid and certain, and had already paralyzed the dying man's limbs. His legs gave way beneath him, he fell into Chicot's arms, and then rolled heavily on the floor. The shock of his fall made a stream of blood flow from his wound, with which the last remains of life ebbed away. Chicot then went and opened the door of communication and called Borromée. He had no occasion to call twice, for the innkeeper had been listening at the door, and had successively heard the noise of tables and stools, the clashing of swords, and the fall of a heavy body. Besides, the worthy Monsieur Borromée had, particularly after the confidence which had been reposed in him, too extensive an experience of the character of gentlemen of the sword in general, and of that of Chicot in particular, not to have guessed step by step what had taken place. The only thing of which he was ignorant was which of the two adversaries had fallen. It must, however, be said in praise of Maitre Bonhomet that his face assumed an expression of real satisfaction when he heard Chicot's voice, and when he saw that it was the Gascon who, safe and sound, opened the door. Chicot, whom nothing escaped, remarked the expression of his countenance, and was inwardly pleased at it. Bonhomet tremblingly entered the apartment. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed as he saw the captain's body bathed in blood. "Yes, my poor Bonhomet," said Chicot, "this is what we have come to. Our dear captain here is very ill, as you see."
"Oh, my good Monsieur Chicot, my good Monsieur Chicot!"
exclaimed Bonhomet, ready to faint. "Well, what?" inquired Chicot.
"It is very unkind of you that you have chosen my inn for this execution. Such a handsome captain, too."
"Would you sooner have seen Chicot lying there and Borromée alive?"
"Oh no, oh no!"
cried the host from the very bottom of his heart. "Well, that would have happened, however, had it not been for a miracle of Providence."
"Really?"
"Upon the word of Chicot, just look at my back, for it pains me a good deal, my dear friend." And he stooped down before the innkeeper, so that both his shoulders might be on a level with the host's eye. Between the two shoulders the doublet was pierced through, and a spot of blood as large and round as a silver crown piece reddened the edges of the hole.
"Blood!" cried Bonhomet. "Blood! Ah, you are wounded!"
"Wait, wait!" And Chicot unfastened his doublet and his shirt. "Now look," he said.
"Oh, you wore a cuirass! What a fortunate thing, dear Monsieur Chicot! And you were saying that the ruffian wished to assassinate you?"
"Diable! It hardly seems likely I should have taken any pleasure in giving myself a dagger thrust between my own shoulders. Now, what do you see?"
"A link broken."
"That dear captain was in good earnest, then. Is there much blood?"
"Yes, a good deal under the links."
"I must take off the cuirass, then," said Chicot. Chicot took off his cuirass and bared the upper part of his body, which seemed to be composed of nothing else but bones, of muscles spread over the bones, and of skin merely covering the muscles.
"Ah, Monsieur Chicot," exclaimed Bonhomet, "you have a wound as large as a plate."
Yes, I suppose the blood has spread. There is what doctors call ecchymosis. Give me some clean linen. Pour into a glass equal parts of good olive oil and wine dregs, and wash that stain for me."
"But, dear Monsieur Chicot, what am I to do with this body?"
"That is not your affair."
"What? Not my affair?"
"No. Give me some ink, a pen, and a sheet of paper."
"Immediately, dear Monsieur Chicot,"
said Bonhomet as he darted out of the room. Meanwhile, Chicot, who had probably no time to lose, heated at the lamp the point of a small dagger, and cut in the middle of the wax the seal of the letter. This being done, and as there was nothing else to retain the dispatch, Chicot drew it from its envelope, and read it with the liveliest marks of satisfaction. Just as he had finished reading it, Maitre Bonhomet returned with the oil, the wine, the paper, and the pen. Chicot arranged the pen, ink, and paper before him, sat himself down at the table, and turned his back with stoical indifference towards Bonhomet for him to operate upon. The latter understood the pantomime and began to rub it. However, as if, instead of irritating a painful wound, someone had been tickling him in the most delightful manner, Chicot, during the operation, copied the letter from the Duc de Guise to his sister, and made his comments thereon at every word. "Dear sister, the expedition from Anvers has succeeded for everybody, but has failed as far as we are concerned. You will be told that the Duc d'Anjou is dead. Do not believe it. He is alive. He lives. You understand, and that is the whole question. There is a complete dynasty in those words. Those two words separate the house of Lorraine from the throne of France better than the deepest abyss could do. Do not, however, make yourself too uneasy about that. I have discovered that two persons whom I thought were dead are still living, and there is a great chance of death for the prince while those two persons are alive. Think then only of Paris. It will be time enough for the League to act 6 weeks hence. Let our leaguers know that the moment is approaching, and let them hold themselves in readiness. The army is on foot. We number 12,000 sure men, all well equipped. I shall enter France with it under the pretext of engaging the German Huguenots, who are going to assist Henri de Navarre. I shall defeat the Huguenots, and having entered France as a friend, I shall act as a master."
"Ho, ho!" cried Chicot. "Did I hurt you, dear Monsieur Chicot?" said Bonhomet, discontinuing his frictions.
"Yes, my good fellow."
"I will rub more softly. Don't be afraid."
Chicot continued. "P.S. I entirely approve of your plan with regard to the 45. Only allow me to say, dear sister, that you will be conferring a greater honor on those fellows than they deserve."
"Ah, diable!" murmured Chicot, "this is getting obscure."
And he read it again. "I entirely approve of your plan with regard to the 45. "What plan?" Chicot asked himself. "Only allow me to say, dear sister, that you will be conferring a greater honor on those fellows than they deserve. What honor?" Chicot resumed. "Than they deserve. Your affectionate brother, H. de Lorraine." "At all events," said Chicot, "everything is clear except the postscript. Very good. We will look after the postscript then."
"Dear Monsieur Chicot,"
Bonhomet ventured to observe, seeing that Chicot had finished writing, if not thinking,
"dear Monsieur Chicot, you have not told me what I am to do with this corpse."
"That is a very simple affair."
"For you, who are full of imagination, it may be, but for me—"
"Well, suppose, for instance, that unfortunate captain had been quarreling with the Swiss guards or the Reiters, and he had been brought to your house wounded. Would you have refused to receive him?"
"No, certainly, unless indeed you had forbidden me, dear Monsieur Chicot."
"Suppose that, having been placed in that corner, he had, notwithstanding the care and attention you had bestowed upon him, departed this life while in your charge. It would have been a great misfortune and nothing more, I suppose."
"Certainly."
"And instead of incurring any blame, you would deserve to be commended for your humanity. Suppose, again, that while he was dying this poor captain had mentioned the name, which you know very well, of the prior of Les Jacobins Saint Antoine."
"Of Dom Modeste Gorenflot?"
exclaimed Bonhomet in astonishment. "Yes, of Dom Modeste Gorenflot. Very good. You will go and inform Dom Modeste of it. Dom Modeste will hasten here with all speed, and as the dead man's purse is found in one of his pockets, you understand it is important that the purse should be found. I mention this merely by way of advice.
and as the dead man's purse is found in one of his pockets, and this letter in the other, no suspicion whatever can be entertained."
"I understand, dear Monsieur Chicot."
"In addition to which you will receive a reward instead of being punished."
"You are a great man, dear Monsieur Chicot. I will run at once to the Priory of Saint Antoine."
"Wait a minute. Did I not say there was the purse and the letter?"
"Oh, yes, and you have the letter in your hand."
"Precisely."
"I must not say that it has been read and copied."
"Pardieu, it is precisely on account of this letter reaching its destination intact that you will receive a recompense."
"The letter contains a secret, then?"
"In such times as the present, there are secrets in everything, my dear bon ami." And Chicot, with this sententious reply, again fastened the silk under the wax of the seal by making use of the same means as he had done before. He then fastened the wax so artistically that the most experienced eye would not have been able to detect the slightest crack. He then replaced the letter in the pocket of the dead man, had the linen which had been steeped in the oil and wine applied to his wound by way of cataplasm, put on again the safety coat of mail next to his skin, his shirt over his coat of mail, picked up his sword, wiped it, thrust it into the scabbard, and withdrew. He returned again, however, saying, "If, after all, the story which I have invented does not seem satisfactory to you, you can accuse the captain of having thrust his own sword through his body."
"A suicide?"
"Well, that don't compromise anyone, you understand."
"But they won't bury this ill-starred fellow in holy ground."
"Pooh," said Chicot, "will that be giving him much pleasure?"
"Why, yes, I should think so."
"In that case, do as you like, my dear bon ami. Adieu." Then, returning a second time, he said, "By the by, I pay, since he is no more." And Chicot threw 3 golden crowns on the table, and then, placing his forefinger on his lips in a token of silence, he departed. End of chapter 81. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 82 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 82. The Husband and the Lover. It was with no inconsiderable emotion that Chicot again recognized the Rue des Augustins, so quiet and deserted, the angle formed by the block of houses which preceded his own, and lastly his own dear house itself, with its triangular roof, its worm-eaten balcony, and its gutters ornamented with waterspouts. He had been so terribly afraid that he should find nothing but an empty space in the place of the house, and had so strongly suspected that he should see the street blackened by the smoke of a conflagration, that the street and the house appeared to him miracles of neatness, loveliness, and splendor. Chicot had concealed the key of his beloved house in the hollow of a stone which served as the base of one of the columns by which his balcony was supported. At the period we are now writing about, any kind of key belonging to a chest or a piece of furniture equaled in weight and size the very largest keys of our houses of the present day. The door keys, therefore, following the natural proportions, were equal in size to the keys of our modern cities. Chicot had consequently calculated the difficulty which his pocket would have in accommodating the heavy key, and he accordingly determined to hide it in the spot we have indicated. Chicot, therefore, it must be confessed, felt a slight shudder creeping over him as he plunged his fingers in the hollow of the stone. This shudder was succeeded by a feeling of the most unmixed delight when the cold of the iron met his hand, for the key was really and truly in the spot where he had left it. It was precisely the same with regard to the furniture in the first room he came to, the same too with the small board which he had just nailed to the joist, and lastly, the same with the 1,000 crowns, which were still slumbering in their oaken hiding place. Chicot was not a miser, quite on the contrary indeed. He had very frequently thrown gold about broadcast, thereby allowing the ideal to triumph over the material, which is the philosophy of every man who is of any value. But no sooner had the mind momentarily ceased to exercise its influence over matter, in other words, whenever money was no longer needed, nor sacrifice requisite, whenever, in a word, the senses temporarily regained their influence over Chicot's mind, and whenever his mind allowed the body to live and to take enjoyment, gold, that principle, that unceasing, that eternal source of animal delights, reassumed its value in our philosopher's eyes, and no one knew better than he did into how many delicious particles that inestimable totality which people call a crown is subdivided. "Ventre de biche!"
murmured Chicot, sitting down in the middle of his room, after he had removed the flagstone, and with the small piece of board by his side and his treasure under his eyes. Ventre de biche! That excellent young man is a most invaluable neighbor, for he has made others respect my money, and has himself respected it too. In sober truth, such an action is wonderful in such times as the present. Mordieu, I owe some thanks to that excellent young fellow, and he shall have them this evening." Thereupon Chicot replaced the plank over the joist, the flagstone over the plank, approached the window, and looked toward the opposite side of the street. The house still retained that gray and somber aspect which the imagination bestows on their natural color upon the buildings whose character it seems to know. "It cannot yet be their time for retiring to rest," said Chicot, "and besides, those fellows, I am sure, are not very sound sleepers, so let us see." He descended his staircase, crossed the road, forming as he did so his features into their most amiable and gracious expression, and knocked at his neighbor's door. He remarked the creaking of the staircase, the sound of a hurried footstep, and yet he waited long enough to feel warranted in knocking again. At this fresh summons the door opened, and the outline of a man appeared in the gloom. "Thank you, and good evening," said Chicot, holding out his hand. "Here I am back again, and I am come to return you my thanks, my dear neighbor." "I beg your pardon," inquiringly observed a voice, in a tone of disappointment, the accent of which greatly surprised Chicot. At the same moment the man who had opened the door drew back a step or two. "Stay, I have made a mistake," said Chicot. "You were not my neighbor when I left, and yet I know who you are." "And I know you too," said the young man. "You are Monsieur le Vicomte Ernanton de Carmainges." "And you are the Shade." "Really," said Chicot, "I am quite bewildered." "Well, and what do you want, monsieur?" inquired the young man, somewhat churlishly. "Excuse me, but I am interrupting you, perhaps, my dear monsieur?" "No, only you will allow me to ask you what you may want." "Nothing, except that I wish to speak to the master of this house." "Speak, then." "What do you mean?" "I am the master of this house, that is all." "You? Since when, allow me to ask?" "Diable, since the last 3 days." "Good. The house was for sale, then?" "So it would seem, since I have bought it." "But the former proprietor?" "No longer lives here, as you see." "Where is he?" "I don't know." "Come, come, let us understand each other," said Chicot. "There is nothing I should like better," replied Ernanton with visible impatience. "Only let us do so without losing any time." The former proprietor was a man between 25 and 30 years of age, but who looked as if he were 40. "No, he was a man of about 65 or 66 years old, who looked his age quite." "Bald?" "No, on the contrary, a perfect forest of white hair." "With an enormous scar on the left side of the head, had he not?" "I did not observe the scar, but I did a good number of furrows." "I cannot understand it at all," said Chicot. "Well," resumed Ernanton after a moment's silence, "what did you want with that man, my dear Monsieur l'Ombre?" Chicot was on the point of acknowledging what had just happened. Suddenly, however, the mystery of the surprise which Ernanton had exhibited reminded him of a certain proverb very dear to all discreet people. "I wish to pay him a neighborly visit," he said, "that is all." In this way Chicot did not tell a falsehood, and yet admitted nothing. "My dear monsieur," said Ernanton politely, but reducing considerably the opening of the door, which he held half closed, "I regret I am unable to give you more precise information." "Thank you, monsieur," said Chicot. "I must look elsewhere, then." "But," continued Ernanton as he gradually closed the door, "that does not interfere with my congratulating myself upon the chance which has brought me again into personal communication with you." "You would like to see me at the devil, I believe," murmured Chicot as he returned bow for bow. However, as notwithstanding this mental reply, Chicot in his preoccupation forgot to withdraw, Ernanton, shutting his face between the door and the doorway, said to him, "I wish you a very good evening, monsieur." "One moment, Monsieur de Carmainges," said Chicot. "Monsieur, I exceedingly regret I am unable to wait," replied Ernanton. "But the fact is, I am expecting someone who will come and knock at this very door, and this person will be angry with me if I do not show the greatest possible discretion in receiving him."
"That is quite sufficient, monsieur, I understand," said Chicot. "I am sorry to have been so importunate, and I now retire."
Adieu, dear Monsieur l'Ombre.
Adieu, excellent Monsieur Ernanton.
And as Chicot drew back a step, he saw the door quietly shut in his face. He listened to satisfy himself if the suspicious young man was watching his departure, but he heard Ernanton's footsteps as he ascended the staircase. Chicot could therefore return to his own house without uneasiness and shut himself up in it, thoroughly determined not to interfere with his new neighbor's habits, but, in accordance with his usual custom, equally resolved not to lose sight of him altogether. In fact, Chicot was not a man to slumber on a circumstance which, in his opinion, seemed to be important, without having handled and dissected it with the patience of a first-rate anatomist, in spite of all he could do, and it was a privilege or defect of his organization. Every material impression that his mind received presented itself for analysis, by its most prominent features, in such a manner that poor Chicot's brain suffered considerably on account of such peculiarity, called upon as it was for an immediate investigation of its master's thought. Chicot, whose mind up to that moment had been occupied with that phrase of the Duc de Guise's letter, namely, "I entirely approve of your plan with regard to the 45," consequently abandoned that phrase, the examination of which he promised himself to return to at a later period, in order that he might forthwith thoroughly exhaust this fresh subject of preoccupation, which had just taken the place of the older one. Chicot reflected that nothing could possibly be more singular than the fact of Ernanton installing himself, as if he were its masters, in that mysterious house whose inhabitants had suddenly disappeared, and the more so, since to these original inhabitants a phrase of the Duc de Guise's letter relative to the Duc d'Anjou might possibly have some reference. That was a chance which deserved attentive consideration, and Chicot was in the habit of believing in providential chances. He developed even, whenever he was begged to do so, some very ingenious theories on the subject. The basis of these theories was an idea which, in our opinion, was quite as good as any other. It was as follows: Chance is a kind of reserve held in bond by the deity. Heaven never communicates that reserve except in momentous circumstances, particularly since he has observed that men are sagacious enough to study and foresee the chances which may befall them in accordance with natural causes and regularly organized principles of existence. Moreover, Heaven likes to counteract the combinations of those proud members of the human race whose pride in bygone times he has already punished by drowning them, and whose future pride he surely will punish in destroying them by fire. Heaven, therefore, we say, or Chicot said, Heaven is pleased to counteract the combinations of those proud and haughty human beings by means with which they are unacquainted, and whose intervention they cannot foresee. This theory, as may be perceived, includes some very specious arguments, and might possibly furnish some very brilliant theses, but the reader, anxious as Chicot was to know what Carmagne's object was in that house, will feel obliged to us by tracing the development of them. Chicot accordingly began to think that it was strange to see Ernanton in the very house where he had seen Remy. He considered it was strange for two reasons: the first, because of the perfect ignorance in which the two men lived with respect to each other, which led to the supposition that there must have been an intermediary between them unknown to Chicot; and the second reason, because the house must have been sold to Ernanton, who possessed no means of purchasing it. "It is true," said Chicot, as he installed himself as comfortably as he could on his gutter, which was his usual place of observation. "It is true that the young man pretends he is expecting a visit, and that the visit is from a lady. In these days ladies are wealthy, and allow themselves an indulgence in fancies of all kinds. Ernanton is handsome, young, and graceful. Ernanton has taken someone's fancy, a rendezvous has been arranged, and he has been directed to purchase this house. He has bought this house, and she has accepted the rendezvous. Ernanton," continued Chicot, "lives at court. It must be some lady belonging to the court, then, with whom he has this affair. Poor fellow! Will he love her? Heaven preserve him from such a thing! He is going to fall headlong into that gulf of perdition. Very good. Ought I not to read him a moral lecture thereupon? A moral lecture which would be both useless and absurd, doubly so the former and tenfold the latter. Useless because he won't understand it, and even if he did understand it, would refuse to listen to it. Absurd because I should be doing far better to go to bed, and to think a little about that poor Borromée. On this latter subject," continued Chicot, who had suddenly become thoughtful, "I perceive one thing, namely that remorse does not exist, and is only a relative feeling,
The fact is, I do not feel any remorse at all for having killed Borromée, since the manner in which Monsieur de Carmagne's affair occupies my mind makes me forget that I have killed the man, and if he, on his side, had nailed me to the table as I nailed him to the wainscot, he would certainly have had no more remorse than I have about it myself at the present moment." Chicot had reached so far in his reasonings, his inductions, and his philosophy, which had consumed a good hour and a half altogether, when he was drawn from his train of thought by the arrival of a litter proceeding from the direction of the inn of the Brave Chevalier. This litter stopped at the threshold of the mysterious house. A veiled lady alighted from it and disappeared within the door which Ernanton held half open. "Poor fellow," murmured Chicot. "I was not mistaken, and it was indeed a lady he was waiting for. And so now I shall go to bed." Whereupon Chicot rose, but remained motionless, although standing up. "I am mistaken," he said. "I shall not be able to go to sleep, but I maintain what I was saying, that if I don't sleep it will not be remorse which will prevent me, it will be curiosity. And that is so true what I say in that respect, that if I remain here in my observatory, my mind will only be occupied about one thing, and that is to learn which of our noble ladies honors the handsome Ernanton with her affection. Far better, then, to remain where I am, since if I went to bed I should certainly get up again to return here." And thereupon Chicot resumed his seat. An hour had nearly passed away without our being able to state whether Chicot was engaged in thinking of the unknown lady or Borromée, or whether he was occupied by curiosity or tormented by feelings of remorse, when he fancied he heard the gallop of a horse at the end of the street. Such was indeed the case, for soon after a cavalier, wrapped in his cloak, made his appearance. The cavalier drew up in the middle of the street, and seemed to be looking about him to see where he was. The cavalier then perceived the group which was formed by the litter and its bearers. He drove his horse against them. He was armed, for the rattling of a sword against his spurs could be distinctly heard. The bearers of the litter seemed desirous of barring his passage, but he addressed a few words to them in a low tone of voice, and not only did they withdraw with every mark of respect, but one of them, as he sprang to the ground from his horse, even received the bridle from his hand. The unknown advanced toward the door and knocked loudly. "Well," said Chicot, "I was right in remaining after all. My presentiments, which told me that something was going to take place, have not deceived me. Here is the husband. Poor Ernanton, we shall presently be witness of something serious. If, however, it be the husband, he is very kind to announce his return in so riotous a manner." Notwithstanding the magisterial manner in which the unknown thundered at the door, some hesitation seemed to be shown in opening it. "Open!" cried he who was knocking. "Open, open!" repeated the bearers. "There is no doubt it is the husband," resumed Chicot. "He has threatened the men that he will have them whipped or hanged, and they have declared themselves on his side. Poor Ernanton, he will be flayed alive. Oh, I shall not suffer such a thing, however," added Chicot, "for in fact," he resumed, "he assisted me, and consequently when an opportunity presents itself, I ought to help him, and it seems to me that the opportunity has now arrived, or it never will do so." Chicot was resolute and generous, and curious into the bargain. He unfastened his longsword, placed it under his arm, and hurriedly ran down the staircase. He could open his door noiselessly, which is an indispensable piece of knowledge for anyone who may wish to listen with advantage. Chicot glided under the balcony, then behind a pillar, and waited. Hardly had he installed himself there when the door opposite was opened. Immediately the unknown had whispered a word through the keyhole, and yet he did not venture beyond the threshold. A moment afterward the lady appeared within the doorway. She took hold of the cavalier's arm, who led her to the litter, closed the door of it, and then mounted his horse. "There is no doubt on the subject," said Chicot. "It is the husband, a good-natured fellow of a husband after all, since he does not think it worth while to explore the house in order to be revenged on my friend Carmagne." The litter then moved off, the cavalier walking his horse beside the door of it. "Pardieu," said Chicot, "I must follow those people and learn who they are, and where they are going. I shall at all events draw some solid counsel from my discovery for my friend Carmagne." Chicot accordingly followed the cortege, observing the precaution, however, of keeping in the shadow of the walls, and taking care that the noise made by the footsteps of the men and of the horses should render the sound of his own inaudible. Chicot's surprise was by no means slight when he saw the litter stop at the door of the Brave Chevalier. Almost immediately afterwards, as if someone had been on the watch, the door was open. The lady, still veiled, alighted, entered, and mounted to the turret, the window of the first story of which was lighted.
The husband followed her, both being respectfully preceded by Dame Fournichon, who carried a flambeau in her hand. "Decidedly," said Chicot, crossing his arm on his chest, "I cannot understand a single thing of the whole affair." End of chapter 82. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 83 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 83. Showing how Chicot began to understand the purport of Monsieur de Guise's letter. Chicot fancied that he had already certainly seen, somewhere or another, the figure of this courteous cavalier, but his memory having become a little confused during his journey from Navarre, where he had met with so many different figures, did not with its usual facility furnish him with the cavalier's name on the present occasion. While concealed in the shade, he was interrogating himself, with his eyes fixed upon the lighted window, as to the object of this lady and gentleman's tete-a-tete at the Brave Chevalier. Our worthy Gascon, forgetting Ernanton in the mysterious house, observed the door of the hostelry open, and in the stream of light which escaped through the opening, he perceived something resembling the dark outline of a monk's figure. The outline in question paused for a moment to look up at the same window at which Chicot had been gazing. "Oh," he murmured, "if I am not mistaken, that is the frock of a Jacobin friar. Is Maitre Gorenflot so lax, then, in his discipline as to allow his sheep to go strolling about at such an hour of the night as this, and at such a distance from the priory?" Chicot kept his eye on the Jacobin, who was making his way along the Rue des Augustins, and something seemed instinctively to assure him that he should, through this monk, discover the solution of the problem which he had up to that moment been vainly endeavouring to ascertain. Moreover, in the same way that Chicot had fancied he had recognized the figure of the cavalier, he now fancied he could recognize in the monk a certain movement of the shoulder and a peculiar military movement of the hips, which only belong to persons in the habit of frequenting fencing rooms and gymnastic establishments. "May the devil seize me," he murmured, "if that frock yonder does not cover the body of that little miscreant, whom I wished them to give to me for a travelling companion, and who handles his arquebus and sword so cleverly." Hardly had the idea occurred to Chicot when, to convince himself of its value, he stretched out his long legs, and in a dozen strides rejoined the little fellow, who was walking along holding up his frock above his thin and sinewy legs, in order to be able to get along all the faster. This was not very difficult, however, inasmuch as the monk paused every now and then to glance behind him, as if he was going away with great difficulty and with feelings of profound regret. His glance was invariably directed toward the brilliantly lighted windows of the hostelry. Chicot had not gone many steps before he felt sure that he had not been mistaken in his conjectures. "Hello, my little master," he said. "Hello, my little Jacques. Hello, my little Clement. Halt!" And he pronounced this last word in so thoroughly military a tone that the monk started at it. "Who calls me?" inquired the young man rudely, with something rather antagonistic than cordial in his tone of voice. "I," replied Chicot, drawing himself up in front of the monk. "I. Don't you recognize me?" "Oh, Monsieur Robert Briquet!" exclaimed the monk. "Myself, my little man. And where are you going like that, so late, darling child?" "To the priory, Monsieur Briquet." "Very good, but where do you come from?" "I?" "Of course, little libertine." The young man started. "I don't know what you are saying, Monsieur Briquet," he replied. "On the contrary, I have been sent with a very important commission to Dom Modeste, who will himself assure you that such is the case if there be any occasion for it." "Gently, gently, my little Saint Jerome. We take fire like a match, it seems." "And not without reason, too, when one hears such things said as you were saying just now." "Diable! When one sees a frock like yours leaving a tavern at such an hour." "A tavern? I?" "Oh, of course not. The house you left just now was not the Brave Chevalier, I suppose." "Ah, you see, I have caught you." "You were right in saying that I left that house, but it was not a tavern I was leaving." "What?" said Chicot. "Is not the hostelry of the sign of the Brave Chevalier a tavern?" "A tavern is a house where people drink, and as I have not been drinking in that house is not a tavern for me." "Diable! That is a subtle distinction, and I am very much mistaken if you will not some day become a very forcible theologian. But, at all events,
If you did not go into that house to drink there, what did you go there for?" Clement made no reply, and Chicot could read in his face, notwithstanding the darkness of the night, a resolute determination not to say another word. This resolution annoyed our friend extremely, for it had almost grown a habit with him to become acquainted with everything. It must not be supposed that Clement showed any ill feeling in his silence, for on the contrary, he had appeared delighted to meet in so unexpected a manner his learned fencing master, Maitre Robert Briquet, and had given him the warmest reception that could be expected from the close and rugged character of the youth. The conversation had completely ceased. Chicot, for the purpose of starting it again, was on the point of pronouncing the name of Frère Borromée, but although Chicot did not feel any remorse, or fancied he did not feel any, he could not summon up courage to pronounce that name. His young companion, still preserving the same unbroken silence, seemed as if he were awaiting something. It seemed, too, as if he considered it a happiness to remain as long as possible in the neighbourhood of the hostelry of the brave chevalier. Robert Briquet tried to speak to him about the journey which the boy had for a moment entertained the hope of making with him. Jacques Clement's eyes glistened at the words space and liberty. Robert Briquet told him that in the countries through which he had just been travelling, the art of fencing was held greatly in honour. He added, with an appearance of indifference, that he had even brought away with him several wonderful passes and thrusts. This was placing Jacques upon slippery ground. He wished to know what these passes were, and Chicot, with his long arm, indicated a few of them upon the little monk's arm. But all these delicacies and refinements on Chicot's part in no way affected little Clement's obstinate determination, and while he endeavoured to parry these unknown passes, which his friend Maitre Robert Briquet was showing him, he preserved an obstinate silence with respect to what had brought him into that quarter. Thoroughly annoyed, but keeping a strong control over himself, Chicot resolved to try the effect of injustice. Injustice is one of the most powerful provocatives ever invented to make women, children, and inferiors speak, whatever their nature or disposition may be. "It does not matter," he said, as if he returned to his original idea. "It does not matter. You are a delightful little monk, but that you visit hostelries is certain, and what hostelries, too! Those where beautiful ladies are to be found, and you stop outside in a state of ecstasy before the window, where you can see their shadow. Oh, little one, I shall tell Dom Modeste all about it." The bolt hit its mark, more truly so even than Chicot had supposed, for when he began he did not suspect that the wound had been so deep. Jacques turned round like a serpent that had been trodden on. "That is not true," he cried, crimson with shame and anger. "I don't look at women." Yes," pursued Chicot. "On the contrary, there was an exceedingly pretty woman at the Brave Chevalier when you left it, and you turned round to look at her again, and I know that you were waiting for her in the turret, and I know, too, that you spoke to her." Chicot proceeded by the inductive process. Jacques could not contain himself any longer. "I certainly have spoken to her," he exclaimed. "Is it a sin to speak to women?" "No, when one does not speak to them of one's own accord, and yielding to the temptation of Satan." "Satan has nothing whatever to do with the matter. It was absolutely necessary that I should speak to that lady, since I was desired to hand her a letter." "Desired by Dom Modeste?" cried Chicot. "Yes, go and complain to him now, if you like." Chicot, bewildered, and feeling his way, as it were in the dark, perceived at these words a gleam of light traversing the obscurity of his brain. "Ah," he said, "I knew it perfectly well." "What did you know?" "What you did not wish to tell me." "I do not tell my own secrets, and for a greater reason, the secrets of others." "Yes, but to me?" "Why should I to you?" "You should tell them to me because I am a friend of Dom Modeste, and for another reason, you shall tell them to me because—" "Well?" "Because I know beforehand all you could possibly have to tell me." Jacques looked at Chicot and shook his head with an incredulous smile. "Very good," said Chicot. "Would you like me to tell you what you do not wish to tell me?" "I should indeed." Chicot made an effort. "In the first place," he said, "that poor Borromée—" A dark expression passed across Jacques' face. "Oh," said the boy, "if I had been there!" "Well, if you had been there?" "The affair would not have turned out as it did." "Would you have defended him against the Swiss with whom he got into a quarrel?" "I would have defended him against everyone."
so that he would not have been killed. Either that, or I should have got myself killed along with him. At all events, you were not there. So that poor devil breathed his last in an obscure tavern, and in doing so pronounced Dom Modeste's name. Is not that so?" "Yes." "Whereupon the people there informed Dom Modeste of it." "A man seemingly scared out of his wits, who threw the whole convent into consternation." "And Dom Modeste sent for his litter and hastened to La Corne dAbondance." "How do you know that?" "Oh, you do not know me yet, my boy. I am somewhat of a sorcerer, I can tell you." Jacques drew back a couple of steps. "That is not all," continued Chicot, who, as he spoke, began to see clearer by the light of his own words. "A letter was found in the dead man's pocket." "A letter? Yes, precisely so." "And Dom Modeste charged his little Jacques to carry that letter to its address." "Yes." "And the little Jacques ran immediately to the Hotel de Guise." "Oh." "Where he found no one." "Bon Dieu! But Monsieur de Mainville?" "Good gracious!" "And which same Monsieur de Mainville conducted Jacques to the hostelry of the Brave Chevalier." "Monsieur Briquet, Monsieur Briquet!" cried Jacques, "if you know that—" "Ventre de biche! You see very well that I do know it," exclaimed Chicot, feeling triumphant at having disentangled this secret, which was of such importance for him to learn, from the provoking intricacies in which it had been at first involved. "In that case," returned Jacques, "you see very well, Monsieur Briquet, that I am not guilty." "No," said Chicot, "you are not guilty in act, nor in omission, but you are guilty in thought." "I?" "I suppose there is no doubt you think the duchess very beautiful." "I?" "And you turned round to look at her again through the window." "I?" The young monk colored and stammered out, "Well, it is true. She is exactly like a Virgin Mary, which was placed over the head of my mother's bed." "Oh," muttered Chicot, "how much those people lose who are not curious." And thereupon he made little Clement, whom from this moment he held in his power, tell him all he had himself just told him, but this time with the details, which he could not possibly otherwise have known. "You see," said Chicot, when he had finished, "what a poor fencing master you had in Frere Borromée." "Monsieur Briquet," said little Jacques, "one ought not to speak ill of the dead." "No, but confess one thing." "What?" "That Borromée did not make such good use of his sword as the man who killed him." "True." "And now that is all I had to say to you. Good night, Jacques. We shall meet again soon, and if you like—" "What, Monsieur Briquet?" "Why, I will give you lessons in fencing for the future." "Oh, I shall be most thankful." "And now off with you, my boy, for they are waiting for you impatiently at the priory." "True, true. Thank you, Monsieur Briquet, for having reminded me of it." And the little monk disappeared, running as fast as he could. Chicot had a reason for dismissing his companion. He had extracted from him all he wished to know, and, on the other hand, there still remained something further for him to learn. He returned, therefore, as fast as he could to his own house. The litter, the bearers, and the horse were still at the door of the Brave Chevalier. He regained his gutter without making a noise. The house opposite to his own was still lighted up, and from that moment all his attention was directed toward it. In the first place, he observed, by a rent in the curtain, Ernanton walking up and down, apparently waiting with great impatience. He then saw the litter return, saw Mainville leave, and lastly, he saw the duchess enter the room in which Ernanton, palpitating, and throbbing rather than breathing, impatiently waited her return. Ernanton kneeled before the duchess, who gave him her white hand to kiss. She then raised the young man from the ground, and made him sit down before her at a table, which was most elegantly served. "This is very singular," said Chicot. "It began like a conspiracy, and finishes by a rendezvous." "Yes," continued Chicot, "but who appointed this rendezvous?" "Madame de Montpensier." And then, as a fresh light flashed through his brain, he murmured, "I entirely approve of your plan with regard to the 45. Only allow me to say, dear sister, that you will be conferring a greater honor on those fellows than they deserve." "Ventre de biche!" exclaimed Chicot. "I return to my original idea. It is not a love affair, but a conspiracy. Madame la Duchesse de Montpensier is in love with Monsieur Ernanton de Carmainges. let us watch over this love affair of Madame la Duchesse." And Chicot watched until midnight had long passed, when Ernanton hastened away, his cloak concealing his face, while Madame la Duchesse de Montpensier returned to her litter. "Now," murmured Chicot as he descended his own staircase, "what is that chance of death which is to deliver the Duc de Guise from the presumptive heir of the crown? Who are those defunct persons who were thought to be dead but are still living? Mordieu, I shall trace them before long." End of chapter 83. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 84 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 84. Le Cardinal de Joyeuse. Youth has its obstinate resolutions, both as regards good and evil in the world, which are by no means inferior to the inflexibility of purpose of maturer years. When directed toward good purposes, instances of this dogged obstinacy of character produce what are termed the great actions of life, and impress on the man who enters life an impulse which bears him onward, by a natural course, toward a heroism of character of some kind or another. In this way, Bayard and Du Guesclin became great captains, from having been the most ill-tempered and most intractable children that ever existed. In the same way, too, the swineherd whom nature had made the herdsman of Montalt, and whose genius had converted him into sextequinte, became a great pope, because he had persisted in performing his duties as a swineherd in an indifferent manner. Again, in the same way were the worst Spartan natures displayed in a heroic sense, after they had commenced life by a persistence in dissimulation and cruelty. All we have now to sketch is the portrait of a man of an ordinary stamp, and yet more than one biographer would have found in Henri de Bouchage, at 20 years of age, the materials for a great man. Henri obstinately persisted in his affection and in his seclusion from the world, as his brother had begged and as the king had required him to do. He remained for some days closeted alone with his one enduring thought, and then, when that thought had become more and more fixed and unchangeable in its nature, he one morning decided to pay a visit to his brother the cardinal, an important personage, who at the age of 26 had already for 2 years past been a cardinal, and who from the archbishopric of Narbonne had passed to the highest degrees of ecclesiastical dignity, a position to which he was indebted as much to his noble descent as to his powerful intellect. Francois de Joyeuse, whom we have already introduced with the object of enlightening Henri de Valois respecting the doubt he had entertained with regard to Sylla, Francois de Joyeuse, young and worldly minded, handsome and witty, was one of the most remarkable men of the period. Ambitious by nature, but circumspect by calculation and position, Francois de Joyeuse could assume as his device, "Nothing is too much," and justify his device. The only one, perhaps, of all those who belonged to the court, and Francois de Joyeuse was attached to the court in a very especial manner, he had been able to create for himself 2 means of support out of the religious and lay thrones, to which he in some measure approximated as a French gentleman and as a prince of the church. Sixtus protected him against Henry III. Henry III protected him against Sixtus. He was an Italian at Paris, a Parisian at Rome, magnificent and able everywhere. The sword alone of Joyeuse, the high admiral, gave the latter more weight in the balance, but it might be noticed from certain smiles of the cardinal that if those temporal arms failed him, which the hand of his brother, refined and admired as he was, wielded so successfully, he himself knew not only how to use, but also how to abuse, the spiritual weapons which had been entrusted to him by the sovereign head of the church. The Cardinal Francois de Joyeuse had very rapidly become a wealthy man, wealthy in the first place from his own patrimony, and then from his different benefices. At that period the church was richly endowed, very richly endowed even, and when its treasures were exhausted it knew the sources, which at the present day are exhausted, where and whence to renew them. Francois de Joyeuse therefore lived in the most magnificent manner. Leaving to his brother all the pageantry and glitter of a military household, he crowded his salons with priests, bishops, and archbishops. He gratified his own individual peculiar fancies. On his attaining the dignity of cardinal, as he was a prince of the church and consequently superior to his brother, he had added to the household pages according to the Italian fashion, and guards according to that which prevailed in the French court. But these guards and pages were used by him as a still greater means of enjoying liberty of action. He frequently ranged his guards and pages round a huge litter, through the curtains of which his secretary passed his gloved hand, while he himself on horseback his sword by his side, rode through the town disguised with a wig, an enormous ruff round his neck, and horsemen's boots, the sound of which delighted him beyond measure. The cardinal lived therefore in the enjoyment of the greatest consideration, for at certain elevated positions in life, human fortunes are absorbing in their nature, and, as if they were composed of nothing else but of adhesive particles, oblige all other fortunes to attend on and follow them like satellites, and on that account, therefore, the recent and marvelous successes of his brother Anne reflected on him all the brilliancy of those achievements. Moreover, as he had scrupulously followed the precept of concealing his mode of life, and of dispensing and diffusing his mental wealth, he was only known by the better sides of his character, and in his own family was accounted a very great man, a happiness which many sovereigns, laden with glory and crowned with the acclamations of a whole nation, have not enjoyed. It was to this prelate that the Comte de Bouchage betook himself after his explanation with his brother, and after his conversation with the King of France. But, as we have already observed, he allowed a few days to elapse in token of obedience to the injunction which had been imposed on him by his elder brother as well as by the king. Francois resided in a beautiful mansion in that part of Paris called La Cité. The immense courtyard was never quite free from cavaliers and litters, but the prelate, whose garden was immediately contiguous to the bank of the river, allowed his courtyards and his antechambers to become crowded with courtiers, and as he had a mode of egress toward the river bank and a boat close thereto, which conveyed him without any disturbance as far as he quietly chose, it not unfrequently happened that the courtiers uselessly waited to see the prelate, who availed himself of the pretext of a serious indisposition or a rigid penance to postpone his reception for the day. For him it was a realization of Italy in the bosom of the capital of the King of France. It was Venice embraced by the two arms of the Seine. Francois was proud, but by no means vain. He loved his friends as brothers, and his brothers nearly as much as his friends. 5 years older than Du Bouchage, he withheld from him neither good nor evil counsel, neither his purse nor his smile. But as he wore his cardinal's costume with wonderful effect, Du Bouchage thought him handsome, noble, almost formidable, and accordingly respected him more, perhaps, than he did the elder of them both, Henri. With his beautiful cuirass and the glittering accessories of his military costume, tremblingly confided his love affairs to Anne, while he would not have dared to confess himself to Francois. However, when he proceeded to the cardinal's hotel, his resolution was taken, and he accosted, frankly enough, the confessor first, and the friend afterwards. He entered the courtyard, which several gentlemen were at the moment quitting, wearied at having solicited without having obtained the favor of an audience. He passed through the antechambers, salons, and then the more private apartments. He had been told, as others had, that his brother was engaged in conference, but the idea of closing any of the doors before Du Bouchage never occurred to any of the attendants. Du Bouchage, therefore, passed through all the apartments until he reached the garden, a true garden of a Roman prelate, luxurious in its shade, coolness, and perfume, such as at the present day may be found at the Villa Pamphile or the Palais Borghese. Henri paused under a group of trees. At this moment the gate close to the river side rolled on its hinges, and a man shrouded in a large brown cloak passed through, followed by a person in a page's costume. The man, perceiving Henri, who was too absorbed in his reverie to think of him, glided through the trees, avoiding the observation of either Du Bouchage or of anyone else. Henri paid no attention to this mysterious entry, and it was only as he turned round that he saw the man entering the apartments. After he had waited about 10 minutes, and as he was about to enter the house, for the purpose of interrogating one of the attendants with the view of ascertaining at what hour precisely his brother would be visible, a servant who seemed to be in search of him observed his approach, and advancing in his direction, begged him to have the goodness to pass into the library, where the cardinal awaited him. Henri complied with this invitation, but not very readily, as he conjectured that a fresh contest would result from it. He found his brother the cardinal engaged, with the assistance of a valet de chambre, in trying on a prelate's costume, a little worldly looking perhaps in its shape and fashion, but elegant and becoming in its style. "Good morning, comte," said the cardinal. "What news have you?" "Excellent news, as far as our family is concerned," said Henri. "Anne, you know, has covered himself with glory in that retreat from Anvers, and is alive." "Heaven be praised! And are you too, Henri, safe and sound?" "Yes, my brother." "You see," said the cardinal, "that Heaven holds us in its keeping." "I am so full of gratitude to Heaven, my brother, that I have formed the project of dedicating myself to its service. I am come to talk seriously to you upon this project, which is now well matured, and about which I have already spoken to you." "Do you still keep to that idea, Du Bouchage?" said the cardinal, allowing a slight exclamation to escape him, which was indicative that Joyeuse would have a struggle to encounter. "I do."
"But it is impossible, Henri," returned the cardinal. "Have you not been told so already?"
"I have not listened to what others have said to me, my brother, because a voice stronger than mine, which speaks within me, prevents me from listening to anything which would turn me aside from my purpose."
"You cannot be so ignorant of the things of this world, Henri," said the cardinal in his most serious tone of voice, "to believe that the voice you allude to was really that of heaven. On the contrary, I assert it positively too. It is altogether a feeling of a worldly nature which addresses you. Heaven has nothing to do in this affair. Do not abuse that holy name. Therefore, and above all, do not confound the voice of heaven with that of earth."
"I do not confound, my brother. I only mean to say that something irresistible in its nature hurries me toward retreat and solitude."
"So far, so good, Henri. We are now making use of proper expressions. Well, my dear brother, I will tell you what is to be done. Taking what you say for granted, I am going to render you the happiest of men."
"Thank you. Oh, thank you, my brother."
"Listen to me, Henri. You must take money, a couple of attendants, and travel through the whole of Europe, in a manner befitting a son of the house to which we belong. You will see foreign countries, Tartary, Russia, even the Laplanders, those fabulous nations whom the sun never visits. You will become absorbed in your thoughts until the devouring germ which is at work in you becomes either extinct or satisfied, and after that you will return to us again."
Henri, who had been seated, now rose, more serious than his brother had been. "You have not understood me, monseigneur," he said.
"I beg your pardon, Henri. You made use of words retreat and solitude."
"Yes, I did; but by retreat and solitude I meant a cloister and not traveling. To travel is to enjoy life still. I wish almost to suffer death, and if I do not suffer it, at least to feel it."
"That is an absurd thought, allow me to say, Henri, for whoever in point of fact wishes to isolate himself is alone everywhere. But the cloister, let it be. Well, then, I understand that you have come to talk to me about this project. I know of some very learned Benedictines, and some very clever Augustines, whose houses are cheerful, adorned with flowers, attractive and agreeable in every respect. Amid the works of science and art, you will pass a delightful year in excellent society, which is of no slight importance, for one should avoid lowering oneself in this world. And if at the end of the year you persist in your project, well then, my dear Henri, I will not oppose you any further, and will myself open the door which will peacefully conduct you to everlasting rest."
"Most certainly you still misunderstand me, my brother," replied Du Bouchage, shaking his head. "Or should I rather say your generous intelligence will not comprehend me. I do not wish for a cheerful residence or a delightful retreat, but a rigorous, strict seclusion, as gloomy as the grave itself. I intend to pronounce my vows which will leave me no other thought or occupation than a grave to dig for myself, or constant prayer."
The cardinal frowned and rose from his seat. "Yes," he said, "I did perfectly understand you, and I endeavored by opposition, without set phrases or discussion, to combat the folly of your resolutions, but you obliged me to do so, and now listen to me."
"Ah," said Henri despondently, "do not try to convince me. It is impossible."
"Brother, I will speak to you in the name of heaven, in the first place, of heaven which you offended in saying that this wild resolution is of its inspiration. Heaven does not accept sacrifices hastily made. You are weak, since you allow yourself to be conquered by a first disappointment. How can heaven be pleased to accept a victim as unworthy as that you offer?"
Henri started at his brother's remark.
"Oh, I shall no longer spare you, Henri. You who never considered any of us," returned the cardinal. "You who forget the grief which you will cause our elder brother and will cause me too."
"Forgive me," interrupted Henri, whose cheeks were dyed with crimson. "Forgive me, monseigneur. But is the service of heaven then so gloomy and so dishonorable a career that all the members of a family are to be thrown into distress by it? You, for instance, my brother, whose portrait I observe suspended in this room, with all this gold and diamonds and purple around you, are you not both the delight and honor of our house, although you have chosen the service of heaven? as my eldest brother has chosen that of the kings of the earth."
Boy," exclaimed the cardinal impatiently, "you will make me believe your brain is turned. What! Will you venture to compare my residence to a cloister, my 100 attendants, my outriders, the gentlemen of my suite, and my guards, to a cell and a broom, which are the only arms and the sole wealth of a cloister? Are you mad? Did you not just now say that you repudiate those superfluities, these pictures, precious vases, pomp and distinction, which I cannot do without? Have you, as I have, the desire of hope of placing on your brow the tiara of Saint Peter? That indeed is a career, Henry. One presses onward toward it, struggles for it, lives in it. But as for you, it is the miner's pick, the trappist's spade, the gravedigger's tomb that you desire. Utter abandonment of life, of pleasure, of hope, and all that. I blush with shame for you, a man. All that, I say, because you love a woman who loves you not. You do foul injustice to your race, Henry, most truly."
"Brother!" exclaimed the young man, pale as death, while his eyes blazed with kindling fire, "would you sooner have me blow out my brains or plunge in my heart the sword I have the honor to wear by my side? Pardieu, monseigneur, if you, who are cardinal and prince besides, will give me absolution for so mortal a sin, the affair will be so quickly done that you shall have no time to complete your odious and unworthy thought that I am capable of dishonoring my race, which, heaven be praised, de Joyeuse will never do."
Come, Henry," said the cardinal, drawing his brother toward him and pressing him in his arms. "Come, forget what is past, and think of those who love you. I have personal motives for entreating you. Listen to me. A rare occurrence in this world of ours. We are all happy, some from feelings of gratified ambition, the others from blessings of every kind with which heaven has bedecked our existence. Do not, I implore you, Henry, cast the mortal poison of the retreat you speak of upon our family happiness. Think how our father would be grieved at it. Think, too, how all of us would bear on our countenances the dark reflection of the bitter mortification you are about to inflict upon us. I beseech you, Henry, to allow yourself to be persuaded the cloister will not benefit you. I do not say that you will die there, for, misguided man, your answer will be a smile which, alas, would be only too intelligible for me. No, believe me that the cloister is far more fatal to you than the tomb. The tomb annihilates but life itself. The cloister annihilates intelligence. The cloister bows the head instead of raising it to heaven. The cold, humid atmosphere of the vaults passes by degrees into the blood and penetrates the very marrow of the bones, changing the cloistered recluse into another granite statue in the convent. My brother, my dear brother, take heed. Our time here below is but brief. Youth visits us but once in our lives. The bright years of our earlier days will pass away too, for you are under the influence of a deep-seated grief. But at 30 years of age you will have become a man. The vigor of maturity will have then arrived. It will hurry away with it all the remains of your worn-out sorrow, and then you will wish to live over again, but it will be too late. Then, too, you will have grown melancholy in thought, plain in person, suffering in feeling. Passion will have been extinguished in your heart, the bright light of your eye will have become quenched. They whose society you seek will flee you as the whited sepulchre, whose darksome depths repel every glance. Henry, I speak as a friend, seriously, wisely. Listen to me." The young man remained unmoved and silent. The cardinal hoped that he had touched his feelings and had shaken his resolution. "Try some other resource, Henry. Carry this poisoned shaft, which rankles in your bosom, about with you wherever you may go in the turmoil of life. Cherish its companionship at our fetes and banquets. Imitate the wounded deer which flees through the thickets and brakes and forests. In its efforts to draw out from its body the arrow which is rankling in the wound, sometimes the arrow falls."
"For pity's sake," said Henry, "do not persist any more. What I solicit is not the caprice of a moment, or the reflection of an hour. It is the result of a laborious and painful determination. In heaven's name, therefore, my brother, I adjure you to accord me the favor I solicit."
"And what is the favor you ask?"
"A dispensation, monseigneur."
"For what purpose?"
"To shorten my novitiate."
"Ah, I knew it, Dupuissage. You are worldly minded even in your rigorousness, my poor boy. Oh, I know very well what reason you are going to give me. Yes,
You are indeed a man of the world. You resemble those young men who offer themselves as volunteers and are eagerly desirous for fire, balls, and blows, but care not for working in the trenches or for sweeping out the tents. There is some resource left yet, Henri. So much the better. So much the better. Give me the dispensation I ask. I entreat you on my knees. I promise it to you. I will write to Rome for it. It will be a month before the answer arrives, but in exchange, promise me one thing. Name it. That you will not, during this month's postponement, reject any pleasure or amusement which may be offered to you. And if in a month hence you still entertain the same projects, Henri, I will give you this dispensation with my own hand. Are you now satisfied, and have you nothing further to ask me? No, I thank you, but a month is a long time, and the delay will kill me. In the meantime, and in order to change your thoughts, will you object to breakfast with me? I have some agreeable companions this morning." And the prelate smiled in a manner which the most worldly disposed favourites of Henri III would have envied. "Brother," said Du Bouchage, resisting, "I will not accept any excuse. You have no one but myself here, since you have just arrived from Flanders, and your own house cannot be in order just yet." With these words the cardinal rose, and drawing aside a portiere, which hung before a large cabinet sumptuously furnished, he said, "Come, Comtesse, let us persuade Monsieur le Comte de Bouchage to stay with us." At the very moment, however, when the count drew aside the portiere, Henri had observed, half reclining upon the cushions, the page who had with the gentleman entered the gate adjoining the banks of the river, and in this page, before even the prelate had announced her sex, he had recognized a woman. An indefinable sensation, like a sudden terror, or an overwhelming feeling of dread, seized him, and while the worldly cardinal advanced to take the beautiful page by the hand, Henri du Bouchage darted from the apartment, and so quickly, too, that when Francois returned with the lady, smiling with the hope of winning a heart back again to the world, the room was perfectly empty. Francois frowned, then seating himself before a table covered with papers and letters, he hurriedly wrote a few lines. "May I trouble you to ring, dear countess?" he said, "since you have your hand near the bell?" And as the page obeyed, a valet de chambre in the confidence of the cardinal appeared. "Let a courier start on horseback without a moment's loss of time," said Francois, "and take this letter to Monsieur le Grand Admiral à Château-Thierry." End of chapter 84. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 85 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 85. News from Aurilly. On the following day, the king was working at the Louvre with the superintendent of finances, when an attendant entered to inform his majesty that Monsieur de Joyeuse, the eldest son of that family, had just arrived and was waiting for him in the large audience chamber, having come from Château-Thierry with a message from Monsieur le Duc d'Anjou. The king precipitately left the business which occupied him, and ran to meet a friend whom he regarded with so much affection. A large number of officers and courtiers crowded the cabinet. The queen mother had arrived that evening, escorted by her maids of honor, and these light-hearted girls were like sons, always attended by their satellites. The king gave Joyeuse his hand to kiss, and glanced with a satisfied expression around the assembly. In the angle of the entrance door, in his usual place, stood Henri du Bouchage, rigorously discharging his service and the duties which were imposed on him. The king thanked him and saluted him with a friendly recognition, to which Henri replied by a profound reverence. This good intelligence which prevailed between them made Joyeuse turn his head and smilingly look at his brother, without, however, saluting him in too marked a manner, for the fear of violating etiquette. "Sire," said Joyeuse, "I am sent to your majesty by Monsieur le Duc d'Anjou, recently returned from the expedition to Flanders." "Is my brother well, Monsieur l'Amiral?" inquired the king. "As well, sire, as the state of his mind will permit. However, I will not conceal from your majesty that he appears to be suffering greatly." "He must need something to change the current of his thoughts after his misfortune," said the king, delighted at the opportunity of proclaiming the check which his brother had met with, while appearing to pity him. "I believe he does, sire." "We have been informed that the disaster had been most severe." "Sire, but that thanks to you a great portion of the army had been saved. Thanks, Monsieur l'Amiral, thanks. Does poor Monsieur d'Anjou wish to see us?"
"Most anxiously so, sire."
"In that case we will see him. Are not you of that opinion, madame?" said Henri, turning toward Catherine, whose heart was wrung with feelings, the expression of which her face determinedly concealed.
"Sire," she replied, "I should have gone alone to meet my son, but since your Majesty condescends to join with me in this mark of kind consideration, the journey will be a party of pleasure for me."
"You will accompany us, messieurs," said the king to the courtiers. "We will set off tomorrow, and I shall sleep at Meaux."
"Shall I announce this excellent news to Monseigneur, sire?"
"Not so. What? Leave me so soon, Monsieur l'Amiral? Not so, indeed. I can well understand that a Joyeuse must be loved and sought after by my brother, but we have two of the same family, thank heaven. Dubouchage, you will start for Chateau Thierry, if you please."
"Sire," said Henri, "may I be permitted, after having announced your Majesty's arrival to Monsieur le Duc d'Anjou, to return to Paris?"
"You may do as you please, Dubouchage," said the king.
Henri bowed and advanced toward the door. Fortunately, Joyeuse was watching him narrowly. "Will you allow me to say one word to my brother?" he inquired.
"Do so, but what is it?"
said the king in an undertone. "The fact is that he wishes to use the utmost speed to execute the commission, and to return again immediately, which happens to interfere with my projects, sire, and with those of the cardinal."
"Away with you, then, and rate this lovesick swain most roundly."
Anne hurried after his brother, and overtook him in the antechambers. "Well," said Joyeuse, "you are setting off very eagerly, Henri."
"Of course, my brother."
"Because you wish to return here soon again?"
"That is quite true."
"You do not intend, then, to stay any time at Chateau Thierry?"
"As little as possible."
"Why so?"
"Where others are amusing themselves is not my place."
"On the contrary, Henri, it is precisely because Monseigneur le Duc d'Anjou is about to give some fetes that you should remain at Chateau Thierry."
"It is impossible."
"Because of your wish for retirement and of the austere projects you have in view?"
"Yes."
"You have been to the king to solicit a dispensation?"
"Who told you so?"
"I know it to be the case."
"It is true, then, for I have been to him."
"You will not obtain it."
"Why so, my brother?"
"Because the king has no interest in depriving himself of such a devoted servant as you are."
"My brother,
the cardinal will therefore do what his Majesty will be disinclined to do." "And all that for a woman?"
"Anne, I entreat you, do not persist any further."
"Ah, do not fear that I shall begin over again, but once for all, let us to the point. You set off for Chateau Thierry. Well, instead of returning as hurriedly as you seem disposed to do, I wish you to wait for me in my apartments there. It is a long time since we have lived together. I particularly wish to be with you again, you understand."
"You are going to Chateau Thierry to amuse yourself, Anne, and if I were to remain there, I should poison all your pleasures."
"Oh, far from that. I do not care for them. I am of a happy temperament, and quite fitted to drive away all your fits of melancholy."
"Brother."
"Permit me, comte," said the admiral, with an imperious air of command. "I am the representative of our father here, and I enjoin you to wait for me at Chateau Thierry. You will find out my apartment, which will be your own also. It is on the ground floor, looking out on the park."
"If you command me to do so, my brother," said Henri, with a resigned air.
"Call it by what name you please, comte, desire or command, but await my arrival."
"I will obey you, my brother."
"And I am persuaded that you will not be angry with me for it," added Joyeuse, pressing the young man in his arms. The latter withdrew from the fraternal embrace, somewhat ungraciously perhaps, ordered his horses, and immediately set off for Chateau Thierry. He hurried thither with the anger of a vexed and disappointed man; that is to say, he pressed his horses to the top of their speed. The same evening he was slowly ascending, before nightfall, the hill on which Chateau Thierry is situated, with the river Marne flowing at its feet. At his name the doors of the chateau flew open before him, but as far as an audience was concerned, he was more than an hour before he could obtain it.
The prince, some told him, was in his apartments; others said he was asleep, he was practicing music, the valet de chambre supposed. No one, however, among the attendants could give a positive reply. Henri persisted, in order that he might no longer have to think of his service on the king, so that he might abandon himself from that moment to his melancholy thoughts unrestrained. Won over by his perseverance, it being well known, too, that he and his brother were on the most intimate terms with the duke, Henri was ushered into one of the salons on the first floor, where the prince at last consented to receive him. Half an hour passed away, and the shades of evening insensibly closed in. The heavy and measured footsteps of the Duc d'Anjou resounded in the gallery, and Henri, on recognizing them, prepared to discharge his mission with the accustomed formal ceremonies. But the prince, who seemed very much pressed, quickly dispensed with these formalities on the part of his ambassador, by taking him by the hand and embracing him.
"Good day, comte," said he. "Why should they have given you the trouble to come and see a poor defeated general?"
"The king has sent me, monseigneur, to inform you that he is exceedingly desirous of seeing your highness, and that in order to enable you to recover from your fatigue, his majesty will himself come and pay a visit to Chateau Thierry tomorrow at the latest."
"The king will be here tomorrow!" exclaimed Francois with a gesture of impatience, but recovering himself immediately afterwards. "Tomorrow, tomorrow," he resumed. "Why, the truth is that nothing will be in readiness, either here or in the town, to receive his majesty."
Henri bowed, as one whose duty it had been to transmit an order, but whose province it was not to comment upon it. "The extreme haste which their majesties have to see your royal highness has not allowed them to think of the embarrassment they may be the means of occasioning."
"Well, well," said the prince hurriedly, "it is for me to make the best use of the time I have at my disposal. I leave you, therefore, Henri. Thanks for the alacrity you have shown, for you have travelled fast, I perceive. Go and take some rest."
"Your highness has no other orders to communicate to me?" Henri inquired respectfully.
"None. Go and lie down. You shall dine in your own apartment. I hold no reception this evening. I am suffering and ill at ease. I have lost my appetite and cannot sleep, which makes my life a sad, dreary one, and which, you understand, I do not choose to inflict upon anyone else. By the by, have you heard the news?"
"No, monseigneur. What news?"
"Aurilly has been eaten up by the wolves."
"Aurilly!" exclaimed Henri with surprise.
Yes, yes, devoured. It is singular how everyone who comes near me dies a violent death. Good night, count. May you sleep well."
And the prince hurried away rapidly. End of chapter 85. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 86 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 86. Doubt. Henri descended the staircase, and as he passed through the antechambers, observed many officers of his acquaintance who ran forward to meet him, and with many marks of friendship offered to show him the way to his brother's apartments, which were situated at one of the angles of the chateau. It was the library that the duke had given Joyeuse to reside in during his residence at Chateau Thierry. Two salons, furnished in the style of Francois I, communicated with each other, and terminated in the library, the latter apartment looking out on the gardens. His bed had been put up in the library. Joyeuse was of an indolent yet of a cultivated turn of mind. If he stretched out his arms, he laid his hand on science; if he opened the windows, he could enjoy the beauties of nature. Finer and superior organizations require more satisfying enjoyments, and the morning breeze, the song of birds, or the perfume of flowers, added fresh delight to the triplets of Clement Marot or to the odes of Rousard. Henri determined to leave everything as it was, not because he was influenced by the poetic sabbatism of his brother, but, on the contrary, from indifference, and because it mattered little to him whether he was there or elsewhere. But as the count, in whatever frame of mind he might be, had been brought up never to neglect his duty or respect toward the king or the princes of the royal family of France, he inquired particularly in what part of the chateau the prince had resided since his return. By mere accident, in this respect, Henri met with an excellent cicerone in the person of the young ensign, who, by some act of indiscretion or another, had, in the little village in Flanders where we represented the personages in this tale as having halted for a moment, communicated the count's secret to the prince. This ensign had not quitted the prince's side since his return, and could inform Henri very accurately on the subject. On his arrival at Chateau Thierry, the prince had at first entered upon a course of reckless dissipation. At that time he occupied the state apartments of the chateau, had receptions morning and evening, and was engaged during the day stag hunting in the forest. But since the intelligence of Aurilly's death, which had reached the prince without its being known from what source, the prince had retired to a pavilion situated in the middle of the park. This pavilion, which was an almost inaccessible retreat except to the intimate associates of the prince, was hidden from view by the dense foliage of the surrounding trees, and could hardly be perceived above their lofty summits, or through the thick foliage of the hedges. It was to this pavilion that the prince had retired during the last few days. Those who did not know him well said that it was Aurilly's death which had made him betake himself to this solitude, while those who were well acquainted with his character pretended that he was carrying out in this pavilion some base or infamous plot, which some day or another would be revealed to the light. A circumstance which rendered either of these suppositions much more probable was that the prince seemed greatly annoyed whenever a matter of business or a visit summoned him to the chateau, and so decidedly was this the case, that no sooner had the visit been received or the matter of business been dispatched than he returned to his solitude, where he was waited upon only by the two old valets de chambre who had been present at his birth. "Since this is the case," observed Henri, "the fetes will not be very gay if the prince continue in this humor." "Certainly," replied the ensign, "for everyone will know how to sympathize with the prince's grief, whose pride as well as whose affections had been so smitten." Henri continued his interrogatories without intending it, and took a strange interest in doing so. The circumstance of Aurilly's death, whom he had known at court, and whom he had again met in Flanders, the kind of indifference with which the prince had announced the loss he had met with, the strict seclusion in which it was said that the prince had lived since his death, all this seemed to him, without his being able to assign a reason for his belief, as part of that mysterious and darkened web wherein, for some time past, the events of his life had been woven. "And," inquired he of the ensign, "it is not known, you say, how the prince became acquainted with the news of the death of Aurilly?" "No." "But surely," he insisted, "people must talk about it." "Oh, of course," said the ensign. "True or false, you know, people always will talk." "Well, then, tell me what it is." "It is said that the prince was hunting under the willows close beside the river, and that he had wandered away from the others who were hunting also, for everything he does is by fits and starts, and he becomes as excited in the fields as at play, or under fire, or under the influence of grief, when suddenly he was seen returning with a face scared and as pale as death. The courtiers questioned him, thinking that it was nothing more than a mere incident of the hunting field. He held 2 rouleaux of gold in his hand. "Can you understand this, messieurs?" he said in a hard, dry voice. "Aurilly is dead. Aurilly has been eaten by the wolves." Everyone immediately exclaimed. "Nay, indeed," said the prince. "May the foul friend take me if it be not so. The poor lute player had always been a far better musician than a horseman. It seems that his horse ran away with him, and that he fell into a pit, where he was killed. The next day a couple of travelers who were passing close to the pit discovered his body half eaten by the wolves, and a proof that the affair actually did happen, as I have related it, and that robbers have nothing whatever to do with the whole matter is, that here are the 2 rouleaux of gold which he had about him, and which have been faithfully restored." "However, as no one had been seen to bring these 2 rouleaux of gold back," continued the ensign, "it is supposed that they had been handed to the prince by the 2 travelers, who, having met and recognized his highness on the banks of the river, had announced the intelligence of Aurilly's death." "It is very strange," murmured Henri. "And what is more strange still," continued the ensign, "is that it is said—can it be true, or is it merely an invention? It is said, I repeat, that the prince was seen to open the little gate of the park close to the chestnut trees, and that something like 2 shadows passed through the same gate. The prince then introduced 2 persons into the park, probably the 2 travelers. It is since that occasion that the prince has retired into his pavilion, and we have only been able to see him by stealth." "And has no one seen these 2 travelers?" asked Henri. "As I was proceeding to ask the prince the password for the night, for the sentinels on duty at the chateau, I met a man who did not seem to me to belong to his highness's household, but I was unable to observe his face.
the man having turned aside as soon as he perceived me, and having let down the hood of his cloak over his eyes."
"The hood of his cloak, do you say?"
"Yes, the man looked like a Flemish peasant, and reminded me, I hardly know why, of the person by whom you were accompanied when we met out yonder."
Henri started. The observation seemed to him in some way connected with the profound and absorbing interest with which the story inspired him. To him, too, who had seen Diana and her companion confided to Aurilly, the idea occurred that the two travelers who had announced to the prince the death of the unfortunate lute player were acquaintances of his own. Henri looked attentively at the ensign. "And when you fancied you recognized this man, what was the idea that occurred to you, monsieur?" he inquired.
"I will tell you what my impression was," replied the ensign. "However, I will not pretend to assert anything positively. The prince has not, in all probability, abandoned all idea with regard to Flanders. He therefore maintains spies in his employ. The man with the woolen overcoat is a spy who, on his way here, may possibly have learned the accident which had happened to the musician, and may thus have been the bearer of two pieces of intelligence at the same time."
"That is not improbable," said Henri thoughtfully. "But what was this man doing when you saw him?"
"He was walking beside the hedge which borders the parterre. You can see the hedge from your windows, and was making toward the conservatories."
"You say, then, that the two travelers, for I believe you stated there were two—"
"Others say that two persons were seen to enter, but I only saw one, the man in the overcoat."
"In that case, then, you have reason to believe that the man in the overcoat, as you describe him, is living in the conservatories."
"It is not unlikely."
"And have these conservatories a means of exit?"
"Yes, count, toward the town."
Henri remained silent for some time. His heart was throbbing most violently, for these details, which were apparently matters of indifference to him, who seemed throughout the whole of this mystery as if he were gifted with the power of prevision, were in reality full of the deepest interest for him. Night had in the meantime closed in, and the two young men were conversing together without any light in Joyeuse's apartment. Fatigued by his journey, oppressed by the strange events which had just been related to him, unable to struggle against the emotions which they had aroused in his breast, the count had thrown himself on his brother's bed, and mechanically directed his gaze toward the deep blue heavens above him, which seemed set as with diamonds. The young ensign was seated on the ledge of the window, and voluntarily abandoned himself to that listlessness of thought, to that poetic reverie of youth, to that absorbing languor of feeling which the balmy freshness of the evening inspires. A deep silence reigned throughout the park and the town. The gates were closed, the lights were kindled by degrees, the dogs in the distance were barking in their kennels at the servants, on whom devolved the duty of shutting up the stables in the evening. Suddenly the ensign rose to his feet, made a sign of attention with his head, leaned out of the window, and then, calling in a quick, low tone to the count, who was reclining on the bed, said, "Come, come." "What is the matter?" Henri inquired, arousing himself by a strong effort from his reverie. "The man, the man." "What man?" "The man in the overcoat, the spy." "Oh!" exclaimed Henri, springing from the bed to the window and leaning on the ensign. "Stay," continued the ensign. "Do you see him yonder? He is creeping along the hedge. Wait a moment, he will show himself again. Now look toward that spot which is illuminated by the moon's rays. There he is, there he is." "Yes." "Do you not think he is a sinister-looking fellow?" "Sinister is the very word," replied Du Bouchage in a gloomy voice. "Do you believe he is a spy?" "I believe nothing, and yet I believe everything." "See, he is going from the prince's pavilion to the conservatories." "The prince's pavilion is in that direction, then?" inquired Du Bouchage, indicating with his finger the direction from which the stranger appeared to be proceeding. "Do you see that light whose rays are trembling through the leaves of the trees?" "Well?" "That is the dining room." "Ah!" exclaimed Henri. "See, he makes his appearance again." "Yes, he is no doubt going to the conservatories to join his companion. Did you hear that?" "What?" "The sound of a key turning in the lock." "It is singular," said Du Bouchage. "There is nothing unusual in all this, and yet—" "And yet you are trembling, you were going to say?" "Yes," said the count, "but what is that?" The sound of a bell was heard. "It is the signal for the supper of the prince's household. Are you going to join us at supper, count?" No, I thank you. I do not require anything, and if I should feel hungry, I will call for what I may need."
"Do not wait for that, monsieur, but come and amuse yourself in our society."
"Nay, nay, it is impossible."
"Why so?"
"His Royal Highness almost directed me to have what I should need served to me in my own apartment, but do not let me delay you."
"Thank you, count. Good evening. Do not lose sight of our phantom."
"Oh, rely on me for that, unless," added Henri, who feared he might have said too much, "unless, indeed, I should be overtaken by sleep, which seems more than probable, and a far more healthy occupation than that of watching shadows and spies."
"Certainly," said the ensign laughingly, as he took leave of Henri du Bouchage. Hardly had he quitted the library than Henri darted into the garden.
"Oh," he murmured, "it is Remy, it is Remy. I should know him again in the darkness of hell itself."
And the young man, as he felt his knees tremble beneath him, buried his burning forehead in his cold, damp hands.
"Good heavens!" he cried, "is not this rather a fantasy of my poor fevered brain? And is it not written that in my slumbering and in my waking moments, day and night, I should ever see those two figures who have made so deep and dark a furrow in my life? Why," he continued, like a man aware of the need that exists of convincing himself, "why indeed should Remy be here in this chateau, while the Duke d'Anjou is here? What is his motive in coming here? What could the Duke d'Anjou possibly have to do with Remy? And why should he have quitted Diana, he who is her eternal companion? No, it is not he."
Then again, a moment afterward, a conviction, thorough, profound, almost instinctive in its nature, seemed to overcome all the doubts he had entertained.
"It is he," he murmured,
in utter despair, and leaning against the wall to save himself from falling. As he finished giving utterance to this overpowering, overwhelming thought, which seemed to crush all others in his mind, the sharp sound of the lock was again heard, and, although the sound was almost imperceptible, his overexcited senses detected it instantly. An indefinable shudder ran through the young man's whole frame. Again he listened with eager attention. So profound a silence reigned around him on every side that he could hear the throbbings of his own heart. A few minutes passed away without anything he expected making its appearance. In default of his eyes, however, his ears told him that someone was approaching, for he heard the sound of the gravel under the advancing footsteps. Suddenly the straight black line of the hedge seemed broken. He imagined he saw upon this dark background a group still darker moving along.
"It is he returning again," muttered Henri. "Is he alone, or is someone with him?"
The objects advanced from the side where the silver light of the moon had illuminated a space of open ground. It was at the very moment when, advancing in the opposite direction, the man in the overcoat crossed this open space, that Henri fancied he recognized Remy. This time Henri observed two shadows very distinctly. It was impossible he could be mistaken. A death-like chill struck to his heart, and seemed to have turned it to marble. The two shadows walked quickly along, although with a firm step. The former was dressed in a woolen overcoat, and at the appearance of the second apparition, as that of the first, the count fancied he recognized Remy. The second, who was completely enveloped in a large man's cloak, seemed to defy every attempt at recognition. And yet beneath that cloak Henri fancied he could detect what no human eye could have possibly seen. He could not control a deep bitter groan of despair, and no sooner had the two mysterious personages disappeared behind the hedge than the young man darted after them, and stealthily glided from one group of trees to another, in the wake of those whom he was so anxious to discover.
"Oh," he murmured as he stole along, "do I not indeed deceive myself? Oh, heaven! Can it really be possible?"
End of chapter 86. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 87 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 87. Certainty. Henri glided along the hedge on the side which was thrown into deep shade, taking care to make no noise either on the gravel or against the trees. Obliged to walk carefully, and while walking to watch carefully over every movement he made, he could not perceive anything, and yet by his style, his dress, his walk, he still fancied he recognized Remy in the man who wore the overcoat.
Mere conjectures, more terrifying for him than realities, arose in his mind with regard to this man's companion. The road which they were following, and which was bounded by a row of elms, terminated in a high hawthorn hedge which separated from the rest of the park the pavilion of the Duc d'Anjou, and enveloped it as with a curtain of verdure, in the midst of which, as has been already observed, it entirely disappeared in a remote corner of the grounds of the chateau. There were several beautiful sheets of water, dark underwood, through which winding paths had been cut, and venerable trees, over the summits of which the moon was shedding its streams of silver light, while underneath the gloom was thick, dark, and impenetrable. As he approached this hedge, Henri felt that his heart was on the point of failing him. In fact, to transgress so boldly the prince's orders, and to abandon himself to a course of conduct as indiscreet as it was rash, was the act not of a loyal and honorable man, but of a mean and cowardly spy, or of a jealous man driven to extremities. But as, while opening the gate which separated the greater from the smaller park, the man he followed moved in such a way that his features were revealed, and as he perceived that these features were indeed those of Remy, the count's scruples vanished, and he resolutely advanced at all hazards. Henri found the gate again closed. He leaped over the railings, and then continued his pursuit of the prince's two strange visitors, who still seemed to be hurrying onward. Another cause of terror was soon added, for the duke, on hearing the footsteps of Remy and his companion upon the gravel walk, made his appearance from the pavilion. Henri threw himself behind the largest of the trees and waited. He could not see anything, except that he observed that Remy made a very low salutation, that Remy's companion courtesied like a woman, instead of bowing like a man, and that the duke, seemingly transported with delight, offered his arm to the latter, in the same way as he would have done to a woman. Then all three advanced toward the pavilion, disappeared under the vestibule, and the door closed behind them. "This must end," said Henri, "and I must seek a more convenient place, where I can see everything that may pass without being seen." He decided in favor of a clump of trees, situated between the pavilion and the wall, from the center of which the waters of a fountain gushed forth, thus forming an impenetrable place of concealment, for it was not likely that in the night time, with the freshness and humidity which would naturally be found near this fountain, the prince would seek the vicinity of the water in the thickets. Hidden behind the statue with which the fountain was ornamented, and standing at his full height behind the pedestal, Henri was enabled to see what was taking place in the pavilion, the principal window of which was quite open before him. As no one could, or rather as no one would, venture to penetrate so far, no precautions had been taken. A table was laid, sumptuously served with the richest viands, and with rare wines in bottles of costly Venetian glass. 2 seats only at this table seemed to be awaiting 2 guests. The duke approached one of the chairs, then, leaving the arm of Remy's companion and pointing to the other seat, he seemed to request that the cloak might be thrown aside, as, although it might be very serviceable for an evening stroll, it became very inconvenient when the object of the stroll was attained, and when that object was a supper. Thereupon the individual to whom the invitation had been addressed threw the cloak upon a chair, and the dazzling blaze of the flambeaux lighted up, without a shadow on their loveliness, the pale and majestically beautiful features of a woman whom the terrified eyes of Henri immediately recognized. It was the lady of the mysterious house in the Rue d'Augustin, the wanderer in Flanders. In one word, it was that Diana whose gaze was as mortal as the thrust of a dagger. On this occasion she wore the apparel of her own sex, and was richly dressed in brocaded silk. Diamonds blazed on her neck, in her hair, and on her wrists, and thereby made the extreme pallor of her face more remarkable than ever, and in the light which shone from her eyes it almost seemed as if the duke had, by the employment of some magical means, evoked the ghost of this woman, rather than the woman herself. Had it not been for the support afforded by the statue round which he had thrown his arms, colder even than the marble itself, Henri would have fallen backward headlong into the basin of the fountain. The duke seemed intoxicated with delight. He fixed his passionate gaze upon this beautiful creature, who had seated herself opposite to him, and who hardly touched the dishes which had been placed before her. From time to time Francois leaned across the table to kiss one of the hands of his silent guest, who, as pale as death, seemed as insensible to his kisses as if her hand had been sculptured in alabaster, which, for transparency and perfect whiteness, it so much resembled. From time to time Henri started, raised his hand to his forehead, and with it wiped away the death-like sweat which rose on it, and asked himself, "Is she alive or dead?" The duke tried his utmost efforts and displayed all his powers of eloquence to unbend the rigid beauty of her face. Remy, the only attendant, for the duke had sent everyone away,
waited on them both, and occasionally, lightly touching his mistress with his elbow as he passed behind her chair, seemed to revive her by the contact and to recall her to life, or rather to the position in which she was placed. Thereupon a bright flush spread over her whole face, her eyes sparkled, she smiled as if some magician had touched a spring unknown to this automaton-like figure, seemingly endowed with intelligence, and the mechanism of which had drawn the lightning glance from her eyes, the glowing flush on her cheek, and the sparkling smile to her lips. The moment after, she again subsided into her calm and statue-like stillness. The prince, however, approached her, and by the passionate tone of his conversation, seemed as if he had succeeded in warming into animation his new conquest. Thereupon Diana, who occasionally glanced at the face of a magnificent clock suspended over the prince's head, against the opposite side of the wall to where she was seated, seemed to make an effort over herself, and with her lips bedecked with smiles took a more active part in the conversation. Henri, concealed in his leafy covert, wrung his hands in despair and cursed the whole creation in the utter wretchedness of his sore distress. It seemed to him monstrous, almost iniquitous, that this woman, so pure and rigidly inflexible, should yield herself so unresistingly to the prince, because he was a prince, and abandon herself to love because it was offered within the precincts of a palace. His horror at Remy was so extreme that he could have slain him without remorse, in order to see whether so great a monster had the blood and heart of a man in him. In such paroxysms of rage and contempt did Henri pass the time during the supper, which to the Duc d'Anjou was so full of rapture and delight. Diana sang. The prince, inflamed by wine and by his passionate discourse, rose from the table for the purpose of embracing Diana. Every drop of blood seemed to curdle in Henri's veins. He put his hand to his side to see if his sword were there, and then thrust it into his breast in search of a dagger. Diana, with a strange smile, which most assuredly had never until that moment had its counterpart on any face, stopped the duke as he was approaching her.
"Will you allow me, Monseigneur," she said, "before I rise from the table, to share with your Royal Highness one of those tempting-looking peaches?"
And with these words she stretched out her hand toward a basket of gold filigree work, in which 20 peaches were tastefully arranged, and took one. Then, taking from her girdle a beautiful little dagger with a silver blade and a handle of malachite, she divided the peach into 2 portions, and offered one of them to the prince, who seized it and carried it eagerly to his lips, as though he would thus have kissed Diana's. This impassioned action produced so deep an impression on himself that a cloud seemed to obscure his sight at the very moment he bit into the fruit. Diana looked at him with her clear, steady gaze and her fixed, immovable smile. Remy, leaning his back against a pillar of carved wood, also looked on with a gloomy expression of countenance. The prince passed one of his hands across his forehead, wiped away the perspiration which had gathered there, and swallowed the piece that he had bitten. This perspiration was most probably the symptom of a sudden indisposition, for while Diana ate the other half of the peach, the prince let fall on his plate what remained of the portion he had taken, and with difficulty rising from his seat, seemed to invite his beautiful companion to accompany him into the garden, in order to enjoy the cool night air. Diana rose, and without pronouncing a single word, took the duke's arm, which he offered her. Remy gazed after them, particularly after the prince, whom the air seemed completely to revive. As she walked along, Diana wiped the small blade of her knife on a handkerchief embroidered with gold, and restored it to its shagreen sheath. In this manner they approached the clump of trees where Henri was concealed. The prince, with a passionate gesture, pressed his companion's arm against his heart.
"I feel better," he said, "and yet I hardly know what heavy weight seems to press down on my brain. I love too deeply, madame, I perceive."
Diana plucked several sprigs of jasmine and of clematis, and 2 beautiful roses which bordered the whole of one side of the pedestal of the statue behind which Henri was shrinking terrified.
"What are you doing, madame?" inquired the prince. "I have always understood, monseigneur," she said, "that the perfume of flowers was the best remedy for attacks of giddiness. I am gathering a bouquet with the hope that this bouquet, if presented by me, will have the magical influence which I wish it to possess."
But while she was arranging the flowers, she let a rose fall from her hand, which the prince eagerly hastened to pick up. The movement that Francois made was rapid, but not so rapid, however, but that it gave Diana sufficient time to pour upon the other rose a few drops of a liquid contained in a small gold bottle, which she drew from her bosom. She then took from his hand the rose which the prince had picked up, and placing it in her girdle, said,
"That one is for me. Let us change."
And in exchange for the rose which she received from the prince's hand, she held out the bouquet to him. The prince seized it eagerly, inhaled its perfume with delight, and passed his arm around Diana's waist. But this latter action, in all probability, completely overwhelmed the already troubled senses of the prince, for his knees trembled under him, and he was obliged to seat himself on a bank of green turf, beside which he happened to be standing. Henri did not lose sight of these two persons, and yet he had a look for Remy also, who in the pavilion awaited the termination of this scene, or rather seemed to devour every minute incident of it. When he saw the prince totter, he advanced toward the threshold of the pavilion. Diana, on her side, perceived Francois stagger, sat herself down beside him on the bank. The giddiness from which Francois suffered continued on this occasion longer than on the former. The prince's head was resting on his chest. He seemed to have lost all connection in his ideas and almost the perception of his own existence, and yet the convulsive movement of his fingers on Diana's hand seemed to indicate that he was instinctively pursuing his wild dream of love. At last he slowly raised his head, and his lips being almost on a level with Diana's face, he made an effort to touch those of his lovely guest, but, as if unobservant of the movement, she rose from her seat.
"You are suffering, monseigneur," she said. "It would be better if we were to go in." "Oh, yes, let us go in," exclaimed the prince, in a transport of joy. And he arose, staggering to his feet. Then, instead of Diana leaning on his arm, it was he who leaned on Diana's arm, and thanks to this support, walking with less difficulty, he seemed to forget fever and giddiness too, for suddenly drawing himself up, he, in an unexpected manner, pressed his lips on her neck. She started, as if, instead of a kiss, she had received the impression of a red-hot iron. "Remy," she exclaimed, "a flambeau, a flambeau!"
Remy immediately returned to the salle à manger, and lighted by the candle on the table a flambeau which he took from a small round table, and then, hurrying to the entrance to the pavilion and holding the torch in his hand, he cried out, "Here is one, madame."
"Where is your highness going to?" inquired Diana, seizing hold of the flambeau and turning her head aside. "Oh, we will return to my own room, and you will lead me, I venture to hope, madame," replied the prince in a frenzy of passion. "Willingly, monseigneur," replied Diana, and she raised the torch in the air and walked before the prince.
Remy opened, at the end of the pavilion, a window through which the fresh air rushed inward, in such a manner that the flame and smoke of the flambeau, which Diana held, were carried back toward Francois's face, which happened to be in the very current of the air. The two lovers, as Henri considered them to be, proceeded in this manner, first crossing a gallery to the duke's own room, and disappeared behind the fleur-de-lis hangings, which served the purpose of a portière. Henri had observed everything that had passed with increasing fury, and yet this fury was such that it almost deprived him of life. It seemed as if he had no strength left except to curse the fate which had imposed so cruel a trial upon him. He had quitted his place of concealment, and in utter despair, his arms hanging by his side, and with a haggard gaze, he was on the point of returning, with life ebbing fast, to his apartment in the chateau, when suddenly the hangings behind which he had seen Diana and the prince disappear were thrown aside, and Diana herself rushed into the supper-room and seized hold of Remy, who, standing motionless and erect, seemed only to be waiting her return. "Quick, quick!" she said to him, "all is finished." And they both darted into the garden as if they had been drunk, or mad, or raging with passion. No sooner did Henri observe them, however, than he seemed to have recovered all his strength. He hastened to place himself in their way, and they came upon him suddenly in the middle of the path, standing erect, his arms crossed, and more terrible in his silence than anyone could ever have been in his loudest menaces. Henri's feelings had indeed arrived at such a pitch of exasperation that he would readily have slain any man who would have ventured to maintain that women were not monsters sent from hell to corrupt the world. He seized Diana by the arm and stopped her suddenly, notwithstanding the cry of terror which she uttered, and notwithstanding the dagger which Remy put to his breast, and which even grazed his flesh. "Oh, doubtless you do not recognize me," he said furiously, gnashing his teeth. "I am that simple-hearted young man who loved you, and whose love you would not return, because for you there was no future, but merely the past. Ah! Beautiful hypocrite that you are, and you, foul liar! I know you at last. I know and curse you. To the one I say, I despise and condemn you. To the other, I shrink from you with horror." "Make way!" cried Remy in a strangled voice. "Make way, young fool, or if not—" "Be it so," replied Henri. "Finish your work and slay my body, wretch, since you have already destroyed my soul." "Silence!" muttered Remy furiously, pressing the blade of his dagger more and more against Henri's breast. Diana, however, violently pushed Remy aside, and seizing Du Bouchage by the arm, she drew him straight before her. She was lividly pale, her beautiful hair streamed over her shoulders. The contact of the hand on Henri's wrist seemed to the latter cold and damp as the dews of death.
"Monsieur," she said, "do not rashly judge of matters of which heaven alone can judge. I am Diana de Meridor, the mistress of Monsieur de Bussy, whom the Duc d'Anjou miserably allowed to perish when he could have saved him. 8 days since Remy slew Aurilly, the duke's accomplice. The prince himself I have just poisoned with a peach, a bouquet, and a torch. Move aside, monsieur, move aside, I say, for Diana de Meridor, who is on her way to the convent de hospitalieres."
With these words, and letting Henri's arm fall, she took hold of that of Remy as he waited by her side. Henri fell on his knees, following the retreating figures of the two assassins, who disappeared behind the thick copse, as though it had been a vision from hell. It was not till fully an hour afterward that Du Bouchage, overpowered with fatigue and overwhelmed with terror, with his brain on fire, was able to summon sufficient strength to drag himself to his apartment. Nor was it until after he had made the attempt nearly a dozen times that he succeeded in escalading the window. He walked to and fro in his room several times, and then staggered toward the bed, on which he threw himself. Everyone was sleeping quietly in the chateau. End of chapter 87. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 88 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 88. Fatality. The next morning, about 9 o'clock, the beautiful rays of the sun were glistening like gold on the gravelled walks of Chateau Thierry. Numerous gangs of workmen, who had the previous evening been directed to be in attendance, had been actively at work from daybreak upon the preparations in the park, as well as in the decoration of the apartments destined to receive the king, whose arrival was momentarily expected. As yet nothing was stirring in the pavilion where the duke reposed, for he had on the previous evening forbidden his 2 old servants to awaken him. They were to wait until he summoned them. Toward 9:30, 2 couriers rode at full speed into the town, announcing His Majesty's near arrival. The civic authorities, the governor, and the garrison formed themselves in ranks on either side of the road, leaving a passage for the royal procession. At 10 o'clock the king appeared at the foot of the hill. He had mounted his horse when they had taken their last relays. He never neglected an opportunity of doing so, especially when entering towns, as he rode admirably. The queen mother followed him in a litter. 50 gentlemen belonging to the court, richly clad and admirably mounted, followed in their suite. A company of the guards, followed by Crillon himself, 120 of the Swiss, and as many of the Scotch guards, commanded by Larchant, and all the members of the royal household who accompanied the king in his excursions, mules, coffers, and domestic servants, formed a numerous army, the files of which followed the windings of the road leading from the river to the summit of the hill. Lastly, the cortege entered the town amid the ringing of the church bells, the roar of cannon, and bursts of music. The acclamations of the inhabitants were enthusiastic, for a visit from the king was of such rare occurrence at that time that, seen thus closely, he seemed to be a living embodiment of the divine right. The king, as he progressed through the crowd, looked on all sides for his brother, but in vain. He only found Henri de Bouchage waiting for him at the gate of the chateau. When once within the chateau, Henry III inquired after the health of the Duc d'Anjou from the officer who had assumed the high distinction of receiving the king. "Sire," replied the latter, "His Highness during the last few days has been residing in the pavilion in the park, and we have not yet seen him this morning. It is most probable, however, that as he was well yesterday, he is well also today." "This pavilion is in a very retired part of the park, it seems," said Henri in a tone of displeasure, "since the sound of the cannon does not seem to have been heard." "Sire," one of the duke's 2 aged attendants ventured to remark, "His Highness did not, perhaps, expect your Majesty so soon." "Old fool," growled Henri. "Do you think, then, that a king presents himself in this way at other people's residences without informing them of it? Monsieur le Duc d'Anjou has been aware of my intended arrival since yesterday." And then, afraid of casting a gloom over those around him by a grave or sullen countenance, Henri, who wished to appear gentle and amiable at the expense of his brother Francois, exclaimed, "Well, then, since he has not come to meet us, we will go to meet him."
"Show us the way there," said Catherine from the litter.
All the escort followed the road leading to the old park. At the very moment that the guards, who were in advance, approached the hedge, a shrill and piercing cry rent the air. "What is that?" said the king, turning toward his mother.
"Good heaven!"
murmured Catherine, endeavoring to read the faces of those around her.
"It sounded like a cry of distress or despair."
"My prince, my poor master!"
cried Francois's other aged attendant, appearing at the window and exhibiting signs of the most passionate grief. Everyone hastened toward the pavilion, the king himself being hurried along with the others. He arrived at the very moment when they were raising from the floor the Duc d'Anjou's body, which his valet de chambre, having entered without authority, in order to announce the king's arrival, had just perceived lying on the carpet of the bedroom. The prince was cold, stiff, and perfectly inanimate, and it was only by a strange movement of the eyelids and a nervous contraction of the lips that it could be observed that he was still alive. The king paused at the threshold of the door, and those behind him followed his example. "This is an ugly omen," he murmured.
"Do not enter, my son, I implore you,"
said Catherine to him. "Poor Francois!" said Henri, delighted at being sent away, and thus being spared the spectacle of this agonizing scene. The crowd, too, followed the king as he withdrew.
"Strange, strange,"
murmured Catherine, kneeling down by the side of the prince, or rather of the corpse, no one being in the room with her but the two old servants, and while the messengers were dispatched in every quarter of the town to find the prince's physician, and while a courier galloped off to Paris in order to hasten the attendance of the king's physicians, who had remained at Meaux with the queen. Catherine, with less knowledge, very probably, but not with less perspicacity than Miron himself, could possibly have examined the diagnostics of that singular malady which had struck down her son so suddenly. Her experience was by no means indifferent. In the first place, therefore, she interrogated calmly, and without confusing them, the two attendants who were tearing their hair and wringing their hands in the wildest despair. Both of them replied that the prince had returned on the previous evening about nightfall, after having been disturbed at an inconvenient hour by Monsieur de Bouchage, who had arrived with a message from the king. They then added that when the audience had terminated, which had been held in the chateau itself, the prince had ordered supper to be prepared, and had desired that no one should venture to approach the pavilion without being summoned, and lastly, that he had given the strictest injunctions not to be awakened in the morning, and that no one should enter without a positive summons.
"He probably expected a visit from a lady," observed the queen mother inquiringly.
"We think so, madame," replied the valet respectfully, "but we could not discreetly assure ourselves of the fact."
"But in removing the things from the table, you must have seen whether my son had supped alone."
"We have not yet removed the things, madame, since the orders of Monseigneur were that no one should enter the pavilion."
"Very good," said Catherine. "No one, therefore, has been here?"
"No one, madame."
"You may go."
And Catherine was now left quite alone in the room. Leaving the prince lying on the bed where he had been placed, she immediately commenced the minutest investigation of each symptom, or of each of the traces to which her attention was directed, as the result of her suspicions or apprehensions. She had remarked that Francois's forehead was stained or dyed of a bister color. His eyes were bloodshot and encircled with blue lines, his lips marked with furrows, like the impression which burning sulphur leaves on living flesh. She observed the same sign upon his nostrils and upon the sides of the nose.
"Now let me look carefully,"
she said, gazing about her on every side. The first thing she remarked was the candlestick in which the flambeau which Remy had lighted the previous evening had burned away.
"This candle has burned for a length of time," she said, "and shows that Francois was a long time in this room. Ah, here is a bouquet lying on the carpet."
Catherine picked it up eagerly, and then, remarking that all its flowers were still fresh, with the exception of a rose which was blackened and dried up.
"What does this mean?" she said. "What has been poured on the leaves of this flower? If I am not mistaken, I know a liquid which withers roses in this manner."
She threw aside the bouquet, shuddering as she did so.
"That explains to me the state of the nostrils and the manner in which the flesh of the face is affected, but the lips—"
Catherine ran to the dining room. The valets had spoken the truth, for there was nothing to indicate that anything on the table had been touched since the previous evening's repast had been finished. Upon the edge of the table lay the half of a peach, in which the impression of a row of teeth was still visible. Catherine's attention was drawn to this in a particular manner, for the fruit, usually of a rich crimson near the core, had become as black as the rose and was discolored by violet and brown spots. The corrosive action was more especially visible upon the part which had been cut, particularly so where the knife must have passed.
"This explains the state of the lips," she said, But Francois had only bitten one piece out of this peach. He did not keep the bouquet long in his hand, for the flowers are still fresh. The evil may yet be repaired, for the poison cannot have penetrated very deeply. And yet, if the evil be merely superficial, why should this paralysis of the senses be so complete? And why indeed should the decomposition of the flesh have made so much progress? There must be more that I have not seen."
And as she spoke, Catherine again looked all around her and observed, hanging by a silver chain to its pole, the red and blue parrot to which Francois was so attached. The bird was dead stiff, and the feathers of its wings rough and erect. Catherine again looked closely and attentively at the torch, with which she had once before already narrowly inspected, to satisfy herself that, by its having burned out completely, the prince had returned early in the evening.
"The smoke," said Catherine to herself, "the smoke! The wick of that torch was poisoned. My son is a dead man."
She called out immediately, and the chamber was in a minute filled with attendants and officers to the household. "Miron! Miron!" cried some of them. "A priest!" exclaimed the others. But Catherine had, in the meantime, placed to the lips of Francois one of those small bottles which she always carried in her alms bag, and narrowly watched her son's features to observe the effect of the antidote she applied. The duke immediately opened his eyes and mouth, but no glance of intelligence gleamed in his eyes, no voice or sound escaped from his lips. Catherine, in sad and gloomy silence, quitted the apartment, beckoning to the two attendants to follow her, before they had as yet had an opportunity of communicating with anyone. She then led them into another chamber, where she sat down, fixing her eyes closely and watchfully on their faces.
"Monsieur le Duc d'Anjou," she said, "has been poisoned some time during his supper last evening, and it was you who served the supper."
At these words the two men turned as pale as death.
"Torture us, kill us, if you will," they said, "but do not accuse us."
"Fools that you are! Do you suppose that if I suspected you, that would have been already done? You have not yourselves, I know, assassinated your master, but others have killed him, and I must know who the murderers are. Who has entered the pavilion?"
"An old man, wretchedly clothed, whom Monseigneur had seen during the last 2 days."
"But the woman?"
"We have not seen her. What woman does your majesty mean?"
"A woman has been here, who made a bouquet."
The two attendants looked at each other with an expression of such simple surprise that Catherine perceived, by this glance alone, how perfectly innocent they were.
"Let the governor of the town and the governor of the chateau be sent for," she said.
The two valets hurried to the door.
"One moment,"
exclaimed Catherine, fixing them in their places by this single word as they approached the threshold.
"You only and myself are aware of what I have just told you. I shall not breathe a word about it. If anyone learns it, therefore, it will be from or through one of you. On that very day both your lives shall be forfeited. Now go."
Catherine interrogated the two governors with more reserve. She told them that the duke had received from some person or persons a distressing intelligence which had deeply affected him, that alone was the cause of his illness, and that if the duke had an opportunity of putting a few further questions to the persons again, he would in all probability soon recover from the alarm into which he had been thrown. The governors instituted the minutest search in the town, the park, the environs, but no one knew what had become of Remy and Diana. Henri alone knew the secret, and there was no danger of his betraying it. Throughout the whole day the terrible news, commented upon, exaggerated, and mutilated, circulated through Chateau Thierry and the province. Everyone explained, according to his own individual character and disposition, the accident which had befallen the duke. But no one, except Catherine and Du Bouchage, ventured to acknowledge that the chance of saving the duke's life was hopeless. The unhappy prince did not recover either his voice or his senses, or rather he ceased to give any sign of intelligence. The king, who was immediately beset with the gloomiest fancies, which he dreaded more than anything, would very willingly have returned to Paris, but the queen mother opposed his departure, and the court was obliged to remain at the chateau. Physicians arrived in crowds. Miron alone guessed the cause of the illness, and formed an opinion upon its serious nature and extent. But he was too good a courtier to confess the truth, especially after he had consulted Catherine's looks. He was questioned on all sides, and he replied that Monsieur le Duc d'Anjou must certainly have suffered from some seriously disturbing cause, and had been subjected to some violent mental shock. In this way he avoided compromising himself, therefore, which is a very difficult matter in such a case. When Henri III required him to answer affirmatively or negatively to his question whether the duke would live, he replied, "I will answer your majesty in 3 days."
"And when will you tell me?" said Catherine in a low voice.
You, madame, are very different. I will answer you unhesitatingly.
Well?
Your Majesty has but to interrogate me.
On what day will my son die, Miron?
Tomorrow evening, madame.
So soon?
Ah, madame, murmured the physician, the dose was by no means a slight one.
Catherine placed one of her fingers on her lips, looked at the dying man, and repeated in an undertone this sinister word:
Fatality.
End of chapter 88. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 89 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 89. Les Hospitalieres. The Count had passed a terrible night, in a state bordering on delirium and verging on death. Faithful, however, to his duty, as soon as he had heard the king's arrival announced, he rose and received him at the gate, as we have described. But no sooner had he presented his homage to his Majesty, saluted respectfully the Queen Mother, and pressed the Admiral's hand, than he shut himself up in his own room, not to die, but to carry determinedly into execution his long-cherished project, which nothing could any longer interfere with. Toward 11 o'clock in the morning, therefore, that is to say, as soon as immediately after the terrible news had circulated that the Duc d'Anjou's life was in imminent danger, everyone had dispersed, leaving the king completely bewildered by this fresh event. Henri went and knocked at his brother's door, who, having passed a part of the previous night travelling, had just retired to his own room.
"Ah, is that you?" asked Joyeuse, half asleep. "What is the matter?"
"I have come to bid you farewell, my brother," replied Henri.
"Farewell? What do you mean? Are you going away?"
"Yes, I am going away, brother, and nothing need keep me here any longer, I presume."
"Why nothing?"
"Of course, since the fetes at which you wished me to be present will not take place, I may now consider myself as freed from my promise."
"You are mistaken, Henri," replied the Grand Admiral.
"I have no greater reason for permitting you to leave today than I had yesterday." "I regret that it is so, but in that case, for the first time in my life, I shall have the misfortune to disobey your orders, and to fail in the respect I owe you, for from this very moment I declare to you, Anne, that nothing shall restrain me any longer from taking religious vows."
"But the dispensation which is expected from Rome?"
"I can await it in a convent."
"You must be positively mad to think of such a thing," exclaimed Joyeuse, as he rose, with stupefaction depicted on his countenance.
"On the contrary, my dear and honored brother, I am the wisest of you all, for I alone know what I am about."
"Henri, you promised us a month."
"Impossible."
"A week, then? Longer?"
"Not an hour."
"You are suffering so much, then, poor boy?"
"On the contrary, I have ceased to suffer, and that is why the evil is without a remedy."
"But at all events, this woman is not made of bronze. Her feelings can be worked upon. I will undertake to persuade her."
"You cannot do impossibilities, Anne. Besides, even were she to allow herself to be persuaded now, it is I who could no longer consent to love her."
"Well, that is quite another matter."
"Such is the case, however, my brother."
"What? If she were now willing, would you be indifferent? Why, this is sheer madness."
"Oh, no, no!" exclaimed Henri, with a shudder of horror. "Nothing can any longer exist between that woman and myself."
"What does this mean?" inquired Joyeuse, with marked surprise. "And who can this woman really be? Come, tell me, Henri. You know very well that we have never had any secrets from each other."
Henri trembled lest he had said too much, and that, in yielding to the feeling which he had just exhibited, he had opened a channel by means of which his brother would be able to penetrate the terrible secret which he kept imprisoned in his breast. He therefore fell into an opposite extreme, and, as it happens in such cases, and in order to recall the imprudent words which had escaped him, he pronounced others which were more imprudent still. "Do not press me further," he said. "This woman will never be mine, since she belongs to heaven."
"Folly! Mere idle tales. This woman a nun? She has deceived you."
"No, no, this woman has not spoken falsely. She is now an hospitaliere. Do not let us speak any further of her, but rather let us respect those who throw themselves at the feet of heaven." Anne had sufficient power over himself not to show the delight this revelation gave him. He continued,
"This is something new, for you have never spoken to me about it."
"It is indeed quite new, for she has only recently taken the veil, but I am sure that her resolution, like my own, is irrevocable. Do not therefore seek to detain me any longer, but embrace me, as you love me. Permit me to thank you for all your kindness, for all your patience, and for your unceasing affection for a poor heartbroken man. And farewell." Joyeuse looked his brother full and steadily in the face. He looked at him like one whose feelings had overcome him, and who relied upon a display of feeling to work upon the feelings of others. But Henri remained unmoved at this exhibition of emotion on his brother's part, and replied in no other way but by the same mournful smile. Joyeuse embraced his brother and allowed him to depart. "Go," he said to himself. "All is not yet finished, and however great your hurry may be, I shall not be long before I shall have overtaken you." He went to the king, who was taking his breakfast in bed, with Chicot sitting by his side. Good day," said the king to Joyeuse. "I am very glad to see you, Anne. I was afraid you would lie in bed all day, you indolent fellow. How is my brother?" "Alas, sire, I do not know. I am come to speak to you about mine." "Which one?" "Henri." "Does he still wish to become a monk?" "More so than ever." "And will he take the vows?" "Yes, sire." "He is quite right, too." "How so, sire?" "Because men go straight to heaven that way." "Oh," said Chicot to the king, "men go much faster still by the way your brother is taking." "Will your majesty permit me to ask a question?" "20, Joyeuse, 20. I am as melancholy as I can possibly be at Chateau Thierry, and your questions will distract my attention a little." "You know all the religious houses in the kingdom, sire, I believe?" "As well as I do a coat of arms." "Is there one which goes by the name of les hospitalieres, sire?" "It is a very small, highly distinguished, excessively strict and severe order, composed of 20 ladies, canonesses of Saint Joseph." "Do they take the vows there?" "Yes, as a matter of favor, and upon a presentation from the queen." "Should I be indiscreet if I were to ask your majesty where this order is situated?" "Not at all. It is situated in the Rue de Chevet Saint Landry, in the Cité, behind La Cloître Notre Dame." "At Paris?" "Yes." "Thank you, sire." "But what the devil do you ask me that for? Has your brother changed his mind, and instead of turning a Capuchin friar, does he now wish to become one of the hospitalieres?" "No, sire, I should not think he would be so mad, after what your majesty has done me the honor to tell me. But I suspect he has had his head turned by someone belonging to that order, and I should consequently like to discover who this person is, and speak to her." "Par l'amour Dieu," said the king, with a self-satisfied expression. "Some 7 years ago I knew the superior of that convent, who was an exceedingly beautiful woman." "Well, sire, it may perhaps be the very one." "I cannot say since that time. I too, Joyeuse, have assumed religious vows myself, or nearly so indeed." "Sire," said Joyeuse, "I entreat you to give me at any rate a letter to this lady, and my leave of absence for a couple of days." "You are going to leave me?" exclaimed the king. "To leave me all alone here?" "Oh, ungrateful king," said Chicot, shrugging his shoulders, "am I not here?" "My letter, if you please, sire," said Joyeuse. The king sighed, but wrote it notwithstanding. "But you cannot have anything to do at Paris," said Henri, handing the note to Joyeuse. "I beg your pardon, sire. I ought to escort, or at least to watch over, my brothers." "You are right. Away with you, but return as quickly as you can." Joyeuse did not wait for this permission to be repeated. He quietly ordered his horses, and having satisfied himself that Henri had already set off, galloped all the way until he reached his destination. Without even changing his dress, the young man went straight to the Rue de Chevet Saint Landry. At the end of this street was the Rue d'Enfer, and parallel with it the Rue des Marmouzets, a dark and venerable-looking house, behind whose walls the lofty summits of a few trees could be distinguished, the windows of which were few, bad, barred, and a wicket at the side, completed the exterior appearance of the Convent des Hospitalieres. Upon the keystone of the arch of the porch an artisan had rudely engraved these Latin words with a chisel: Matronae Hospites. Time had partially destroyed both the inscription and the stone. Joyeuse knocked at the wicket and had his horses led away to the Rue des Marmouzets, fearing that their presence in the street might attract too much attention. Then, knocking at the entrance gate, he said, "Will you be good enough to go and inform Madame la Supérieure that Monsieur le Duc de Joyeuse, Grand Admiral de France, is desirous of speaking to her on behalf of the king?" The face of the nun who had made her appearance behind the gate blushed beneath her veil, and she shut the gate. 5 minutes afterwards a door was opened, and Joyeuse entered a room set apart for the reception of visitors. A beautiful woman of lofty stature made Joyeuse a profound reverence, which the admiral returned gracefully and respectfully. "Madame," said he, "the king is aware that you are about to admit, or that you have already admitted, among the number of inmates here, a person with whom I require to speak. Will you be good enough to place me in communication with that person?"
"Will you tell me the name of the lady you wish to see, monsieur?"
"I am not aware of it."
"In that case, then, how can I possibly accede to your request?"
"Nothing is easier. Whom have you admitted during the last month?"
"You either tell me too precisely, or with not sufficient precision, who this person is," said the superior, "and I am unable to comply with your wish."
"Why so?"
"Because during the last month I have received no one here until this morning."
"This morning?"
"Yes, Monsieur le Duc, and you can understand that your own arrival 2 hours after hers has too much the appearance of a pursuit to enable me to grant you permission to speak to her."
"I implore you, madame."
"Impossible, monsieur."
"Will you merely let me see this lady?"
"Impossible, I repeat. Although your name was sufficient for the doors of this house to be thrown open before you, yet, in order to speak to anyone here, except indeed to myself, a written order from the king is necessary."
"Here is the order you require, madame," replied Joyeuse, producing the letter that Henri had signed. The superior read it and bowed.
"His Majesty's will shall be obeyed," she said, "even when it is contrary to the will of heaven."
And she advanced toward the courtyard of the convent. "You now perceive, madame," said Joyeuse, courteously stopping her, "that I have right on my side, but I fear I may be under a mistake, and therefore may be abusing the permission I have received from the king. Perhaps the lady may not be the one I am in search of. Will you be kind enough to tell me how she came here, why she came, and by whom she was accompanied?"
"All that is useless, Monsieur le Duc," replied the superior. "You are under no misapprehension for the lady, who arrived only this morning, after having been expected for the last 15 days. This lady, I say, who was recommended by one who possesses the greatest authority over me, is indeed the very person with whom Monsieur le Duc de Joyeuse must wish to speak."
With these words the superior made another low courtesy to the duke and disappeared. 10 minutes afterwards she returned, accompanied by an hospitaliere, whose veil completely covered her face. It was Diana, who had already assumed the dress of the order. The duke thanked the superior, offered a chair to her companion, himself sat down, and the superior quitted the room, closing with her own hands the doors of the deserted and gloomy-looking apartment. "Madame," said Joyeuse, without any preface, "you are the lady of the Rue des Augustins, that mysterious person with whom my brother, Monsieur le Comte de Bouchage, is so passionately and madly in love." The hospitaliere bowed her head in reply, but did not open her lips. This affectation appeared to Joyeuse almost like an act of rudeness. He was already very indifferently disposed to his companion, and continued: "You cannot have supposed, madame, that it is sufficient to be beautiful, or to appear beautiful, to have no heart lying hidden beneath that beauty to inspire a wretched and despairing passion in the heart and mind of a young man of my name, and then one day calmly to tell him, 'So much the worse for you if you possess a heart, I have none, nor do I wish for any.'"
"That was not my reply, monsieur, and you have been incorrectly informed,"
said the hospitaliere, in so noble and touching a tone of voice that Joyeuse's anger was in a moment subdued. "The actual words are immaterial, madame, when their sense has been conveyed. You have rejected my brother and have reduced him to despair."
Innocently, monsieur, for I have always endeavoured to keep Monsieur de Bouchage at a distance."
"That is termed the art of coquetry, madame, and the result proves the fault."
"No one has the right to accuse me, monsieur. I am guilty of nothing. Your feelings of irritation are aroused against me. I shall say no more."
Oh," said Joyeuse, gradually working himself into a passion. "You have been the ruin of my brother, and you fancy you can justify yourself with this irritating majesty of demeanour. No, no, the steps I have taken must show you what my intentions are. I am serious, I assure you, and you see by the trembling of my hands and lips that you will need some good arguments to move me."
The hospitaliere rose.
"If you have come here to insult a woman," she said, with the same calm self-possession, "insult me, monsieur. If, however, you have come to induce me to change my opinion, you are wasting your time and can withdraw."
"Ha! You are no human creature!" exclaimed Joyeuse, exasperated. "You are possessed by an evil spirit."
"I have already answered. I will reply no further. Since that is not sufficient, I shall withdraw."
And the hospitaliere advanced toward the door.
Joyeuse stopped her. "One moment. I have sought you for too long a period to allow you to leave me in this manner, and since I have succeeded in meeting with you, since your insensibility has confirmed me in the idea which had already occurred to me, that you are possessed by the foul fiend himself, sent hither by the enemy of mankind to destroy my brother, I wish to see that face whereupon the bottomless pit has written its blackest traces. I wish to behold the fire of that fatal gaze which bewilders men's minds. Avaunt thee, Satan!"
And Joyeuse, making the sign of the cross with one hand as if he were exorcising her, with the other tore aside the veil which covered the face of the hospitaliere. The latter, silent and impassible, free from anger or ill feeling, fixed her sweet and gentle gaze upon him who had so cruelly outraged her, and said,
"Oh, Monsieur le Duc, what you have just done is unworthy a gentleman."
Joyeuse's heart was smitten by her reply.
Madame," he murmured after a long silence, "you are indeed beautiful, and truly must Henri have loved you. Surely heaven can only have bestowed upon you loveliness such as you possess to cast it like perfume upon an existence devoted to your own." "Monsieur, have you not conversed with your brother? Or, if you have done so, he cannot have thought it expedient to make you his confidant. Had not that been the case, he would have told you that I have done what you say. I have loved. I shall never love again. I have lived and must die."
Joyeuse had never taken his eyes from Diana's face, and the soft and gentle expression of her gaze penetrated the inmost recesses of his being. Her look had destroyed all the baser material in the admiral's heart. The pure metal was alone left, and his heart seemed rent asunder, like a crucible which had been riven by the fusion of metal. "Yes, yes," he repeated in a still lower voice, and continuing to fix upon her a gaze from which the fire of his fierce anger had disappeared. "Yes, yes, Henri must have loved you. Oh, madame, for pity's sake, on my knees, I implore you to love my brother." Diana remained cold and silent. "Do not reduce a family to despair. Do not sacrifice the future prospects of our race. Be not the cause of the death of one from despair and of others from regret." Diana, still silent, continued to look sorrowfully on the suppliant bending before her. "Oh," exclaimed Joyeuse, madly pressing his hand against his heart, "have mercy on my brother! Have mercy on me!" He sprung to his feet like a man bereft of his senses, unfastened or rather tore open the door of the room where they had been conversing, and, bewildered and almost beside himself, fled from the house toward his attendants, who were awaiting him at the corner of the Rue d'Enfer. End of chapter 89. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 90 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 90. His Highness Monseigneur le Duc de Guise. On Sunday the 10th of June, toward 11 o'clock in the day, the whole court were assembled in the apartment leading to the cabinet in which, since his meeting with Diana de Meridor, the Duc d'Anjou was dying by slow but sure degrees. Neither the science of the physicians, nor his mother's despair, nor the prayers which the king had desired to be offered up, had been successful in averting the fatal termination. Miron, on the morning of this same 10th of June, assured the king that all chance of recovery was hopeless, and that Francois d'Anjou would not outlive the day. The king pretended to display extreme grief, and turning toward those who were present, said, "This will fill my enemies full of hope." To which remark the queen mother replied,
"Our destiny is in the hands of heaven, my son."
Whereupon Chicot, who was standing humbly and reverently near Henri III, added in a low voice,
"Let us help heaven when we can, sire."
Nevertheless, the dying man, toward 11:30, lost both color and sight. His mouth, which up to that moment had remained open, became closed. The flow of blood which for several days past had terrified all who were near him, as the bloody sweat of Charles IX had similarly done at an earlier period, had suddenly ceased, and hands and feet became icy cold. Henri was sitting beside the head of the couch whereupon his brother was extended. Catherine was standing in the recess in which the bed was placed, holding her dying son's hand in hers. The Bishop of Château-Thierry and the Cardinal de Joyeuse repeated the prayers for the dying, which were joined in by all who were present, kneeling and with their hands clasped reverently together. Toward midday, the dying man opened his eyes. The sun's rays broke through a cloud and inundated the bed with a flood of light. Francois, who up to that moment had been unable to move a single finger, and whose mind had been obscured like the sun which had just reappeared, raised one of his arms toward heaven with a horror-stricken gesture. He looked all round the room, heard the murmuring of the prayers, grew conscious of his illness as well as of his weakness, became aware of his critical position, perhaps because he already caught a glimpse of that unseen and terrible future, the abode of certain souls after they have quitted their earthly prison. He thereupon uttered a loud and piercing cry, and struck his forehead with a force which made everyone tremble. Then, knitting his brows as if one of the mysterious incidents of his life had just recurred to him, he murmured, "Bussy, Diana." This latter name had been overheard by none but Catherine, so weakened had the dying man's voice become before pronouncing it. With the last syllable of that name, Francois d'Anjou breathed his last sigh. At this very moment, by a singular coincidence, the sun, which had gilded with its rays the royal arms of France, and the golden fleur-de-lis, which was again obscured, so that the fleur-de-lis, which had been so brilliantly illuminated but a moment before, became as dark and gloomy as the azure ground which they had but recently studded with constellations almost as resplendent as those whereon the eye of the dreamer rests in his upward gaze towards heaven. Catherine let her son's hand fall. Henri III shuddered, and leaned tremblingly on Chicot's shoulder, who shuddered too, but from a feeling of awe which every Christian feels in the presence of the dead. Miron placed a golden spatula on Francois's lips. After a few seconds he looked at it carefully and said, "Monseigneur is dead." Whereupon a deep, prolonged groan arose from the antechamber, like an accompaniment to the psalm which the cardinal murmured, "Cedant iniquitates mei ad vocem deprecationis meae." "Dead," repeated the king, making the sign of the cross as he sat in his fauteuil. "My brother, my brother."
"The sole heir of the throne of France,"
murmured Catherine, who, having quitted the bed whereon the corpse was lying, had placed herself beside the only son who now remained to her. "Oh," said Henri, "this throne of France is indeed large for a king without issue. The crown is indeed large for a single head. No children, no heirs. Who will succeed me?" Hardly had he pronounced these words when a loud noise was heard on the staircase and in the apartments. Nambu hurriedly entered the death chamber and announced, "His Highness, Monseigneur le Duc de Guise." Struck by this reply to the question which he had addressed to himself, the king turned pale, rose, and looked at his mother. Catherine was paler than her son. At the announcement of the horrible misfortune which mere chance had foretold to his race, she grasped the king's hand and pressed it as if to say, "There lies the danger, but fear nothing. I am near you." The son and mother, under the influence of the same terror and the same menace, had comprehended each other. The duke entered, followed by his officers. He entered, holding his head loftily erect, although his eyes ranged from the king to the deathbed of his brother, with a glance not free from a certain embarrassment. Henri III stood up, and with that supreme majesty of carriage which, on certain occasions, his singularly poetic nature enabled him to assume, checked the duke's further progress by a kingly gesture, and pointed to the royal corpse upon the bed, the covering of which was in disorder from his brother's dying agonies. The duke bowed his head and slowly fell on his knees. All around him, too, bowed their heads and bent their knees. Henri III, together with his mother, alone remained standing, and bent a last look, full of pride, upon those around him. Chicot observed this look, and murmured in a low tone of voice, "Desciceit potentes de sede et exaltabit humilis." He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble and meek. End of chapter 90. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Section 91 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Section 91. Postscript. A few words with reference to the principal characters in the novel of the 45 Guardsmen are necessary to complete the story. Diane de MÄ, having taken the vows at the Convent des Hospitalieres, survived the Duke d'Anjou only 2 years. Of Remy, her faithful companion, we hear no more. He disappeared without leaving a trace behind him. History, however, informs us more fully as to the others. The Duke de Guise, having at last broken into open rebellion against Henri III, was so far successful that with the aid of the League he compelled the king to fly from Paris. A hollow reconciliation was, however, patched up between them, the Duke de Guise stipulating that he should be appointed lieutenant general of the kingdom. But no sooner had the king returned to the Louvre than he determined on the assassination of the duke. He sounded Crillon, the leader of the 45, on the subject, but this noble soldier refused to have anything to do with it, offering, however, to challenge him to single combat. De Loignac was less scrupulous, and we know the result. The Duc de Guise and his brother the cardinal were both murdered. 10 days after this event, Catherine de Medicis, the queen mother, died, regretted by none. The Parisians, exasperated by the murder of the Duc de Guise, declared his brother, the Duc de Mayenne, the head of the League, and rose against the king, who was again obliged to fly. He begged the King of Navarre for aid, who promptly responded to the call, and they were shortly before Paris with a united army of Catholics and Huguenots. Henri III was, however, pursued by the relentless hate of the clever and unscrupulous Duchesse de Montpensier. She worked so skillfully on the fanatical mind of the young Jacobin friar, Jacques Clement, that he undertook the death of the king. He entered the camp with letters for Henry, whom he stabbed while reading them. The king died on the 2nd of August, 1589, after having declared Henry of Navarre his successor. Of the subsequent life and adventures of Chicot, unfortunately, nothing authentic is known. End of section 91. End of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia.